What makes John Wick a masterwork of an action movie? Was it just random? Did the writers and director just get lucky putting this movie together? Or is there something happening below the surface that makes this stand out from the crowd of action movies that come out every year? In this video, we're going to do a deep dive story analysis into John Wick to show you why this is a masterwork and give you specific things that you can take away to add to your story that's going to level it up. To do this, we're going to use the story grid methodology. This is a methodology created by Sean Coyne, an editor, writer, and publisher with over 30 years of experience. Doing the analysis is me, Tim Grahl. I'm a writer and I'm a CEO at StoryGrid, and Rachel Arsenal, a StoryGrid certified editor. We use the StoryGrid methodology to break down all the different components of how this movie is put together so that you can learn how to apply them to your own story. If you want to download the full analysis that we've done on John Wick, you can do that right now at storygrid.com/Wick. Otherwise, I'm excited to share this with you. You're going to learn a ton, so make sure you stay on all the way to the end throughout this analysis of John Wick so you can learn how to write your own great action story. So Rachel, before we get into the actual analyzing and looking deep at John Wick, we picked this movie to go over first because you and I both love this movie. So why don't you just tell me a little bit about what it is about John Wick that you love, and why is this movie in particular one you would get excited to spend some time analyzing?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons that I really, really love John Wick. Like, not purely because it is so fun to watch. It is a masterpiece in terms of, this is all cinematic stuff, but it's, Keanu Reeves and his skill as a stuntman. It was created by stuntmen, stunt choreographers, right? And so this was a really cool opportunity to take the action story and for people in stunts to get to utilize like their own kind of art form and bring that into the movie. So that's like, just from a visual like enjoyment perspective, right? That is like thing number one for me, is that it looks great. But from a storytelling perspective, I think that John Wick is such a great example of like knowing your genre and just leaning into it. And just like, I think sometimes we maybe feel a little bit of pressure to like, I want to make sure that it's profound. I want to make sure that it's this like sweeping, beautiful, like magnum opus, but that there's a real beauty and there's a real art form to knowing your genre and just nailing it and just doing it really well and bringing your expertise and your flavor to the genre that you've selected. And so I think those are just a couple of the things that make John Wick so phenomenal. And actually, from a storytelling perspective, it also does storytelling and the kind of story it's wanting to tell really, really well.
Yeah, I remember, it had been out for a little bit. I didn't see the first one in the theater, and it had been out, and I just kind of kept hearing about it, and I just had it written off as like, okay, another action movie. It's Keanu Reeves. I'll watch it eventually. And I remember watching it and being like, holy shit, that I think I just watched the best action movie I've ever seen. You know, and I know like there's going to be fans of Die Hard that are like screaming right now, but I like it better than Die Hard. It's my favorite action movie of all time. And yeah, for me, I just love Keanu Reeves. I just think he's a good human being. So anything he does, I'm automatically on board. But then it's like, I train jujitsu, and so there's tons of jujitsu and judo in it. And then I started looking on YouTube and looked at like the training that he did, that Keanu Reeves did. He practices jujitsu, and the director would like say like, hey, do you know how to do this move in judo or jujitsu? And he'd say no, and so they'd like send him into a jujitsu school to train so he could do it in the movie. So that was cool. And the other thing I love that I think it just adds to the realism of the movie, is the fact that the gunplay is so realistic. So there's all these, you should go on YouTube and watch him, but whichever gun he uses, however many bullets are in a magazine, that's exactly how many bullets he fires before he changes magazines. Same thing with like the shotgun in the second movie. We just watched that last night. And any of the machine guns or anything, that's super realistic, where most action movies, somebody stands there and just like sprays bullets, and they spray like 100 bullets before they like change guns or change magazines. And his is extremely accurate. And how he uses the gun is very accurate. And so I just love all of that part. So, and then, as I thought this was going to be like a super easy, like, hey, it's just like a really great action movie. I should be able to analyze this really easy. And then you and I were talking. I'm like, we could spend a year talking about this movie. Like, it's so deep, but we won't do that. But anyway, yeah, I love it. And so the idea, watching it, I watched it once all the way through and made some notes, and then went back and rewatched several parts to get ready for this. And it was just a joy. So let's start with the 5-leaf genre clover. So this is the innovation that Sean had early on. That genre actually is kind of like a 5-dimensional thing. And what we normally think of genre, we call content genre. It's story grid. And so what did you land on for the global and secondary genres for John Wick? And just so everybody knows, we have not shared notes. So I made my notes, she made hers, so we don't even know if we're going to say the same thing.
Yeah, it's that fact that makes me super nervous, because I think like the external genre, it's like, all right, we probably feel pretty good about like the external genre that's at work here, but it's the internal genre that I'm sort of like sweating it a little bit of like, man, Tim might have something completely different. So for the external, and I think that the global genre is our external genre, I have it as an action, person versus person revenge story. John Wick is
I have the same thing.
awesome. Yeah, he's chasing down Yosef and then Vigo. Pretty straightforward, like revenge for the dog, for the car. And the internal genre, I had a status admiration.
Really? So talk me through that. So I had morality, testing, surrender.
Ooh, interesting. Okay. So I had status admiration because there were a couple of things that were happening in the movie as far as what I was seeing. So what I started paying attention to, so there are some, the episodes I think where you did the eyewitness, you talk about the double factor problem space. Now we're not going into that here, but I was using that as part of a lens to help me think about the genres. And so because what I'm looking for is like, what are all of the different characters in the story sort of navigating? And the way that I was thinking is that there are all these different ways of being in the world of hitmen, right? So the context is sort of like limited to, rather than thinking about like John Wick as like, he's killing all those people in the world at large, we're really kind of zeroed in on this specific world. And there are people who they abide the rules, they follow right the codes, who value loyalty, and even people who, like John Wick, who sort of mitigate the damage that they do in the course of doing business. And so on the other hand, right, you have people who sort of do the opposite of that thing. You have Perkins, who's willing to do business on continental grounds, and she gets the just reward for what she did. Yosef is someone who has power because of his father, and he just takes what he wants. And Vigo, right, he gives someone more money, like if they're willing to do business on continental grounds. And so when I'm thinking about what factor is being pitted against survival, which is sort of comes from our action genre, I think that maintaining like the values or the internal code is what John Wick is sort of like having to decide between. So my thinking is like, if I were to look at this movie, I feel like what John Wick says to me is like, in the world of Hitman, be this way. So that's how I came up with status admiration.
So let me talk through why I came up with morality, testing, surrender, and then we'll see if we can agree on one. All right. So when I look at morality, testing, surrender, this is the quote from the website from StoryGrid. A formally strong protagonist suffers loss, can't recover, and finally resigns the self to weakness. So I don't think status, I think so as we're learning, as Sean is teaching the bestseller blueprint, we're learning that a great masterwork is operating at least 6 different genres. So there's going to be worldview, there's going to be status, there's going to be love, like there's going to be these things. But when I look at and we'll get into the 5 commandments in another episode, but when I look at the 5 commandments and where the story is turning, I think it's turning on, I don't think his status or the status of the world is ever actually in jeopardy. So like, just because Perkins decides to go against it, or just because Vigo goes against it, that doesn't mean if they win, the whole thing's going to die, right? Like, I don't think the whole system will fall apart if a couple people break the rules and get away with it. Where I see this, and I actually see it on this internal as a cautionary tale, because there's this great line, an hour and 8 minutes in, Vigo says, "A lot of us are rewarded for our misdeeds, which is why God took your wife and unleashed you upon me. This life follows you. It clings to you, infecting everyone who comes close to you. We are cursed, you and I." And John responds, "On that we agree." So I feel like that's the thing that's in John's head driving him, is can he escape the curse, or is he going to succumb to the curse? And so he sees himself as formerly strong. So he was strong before his wife died. He was strong before the dog died. When the dog died, he suffers that loss and he never recovers. And I don't even think he recovers at the end, because when he goes into that storeroom and there's all those dogs, he goes in wherever, they're putting down all these dogs. He doesn't pick the cute dog. He picks the pit bull. He picks the fighting dog. And so I think, and I think that's also, the question that keeps coming up, right? So I made super detailed notes. So at 32:20, Jimmy the cop says, "You working again?" And John says, "No, just sorting some stuff out." Then Winston says about 9 minutes later, "I want to ask you this. Have you returned to the fold?" And John says, "Just visiting." And like 2 minutes later, John says, "I'm retired." And Addie, the bartender, says, "Not if you're drinking here, you're not." And then at that 108 and then 109 moment is when John says, "I'm back." So that's why I think it turns on the morality, because that's actually, you don't know which way that's going to go. Where I think the status is not actually ever pushed to the point where the status may fall. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I have to like make sure that I like keep like what, like I have two separate thoughts, so I gotta like track them like one at a time. So I think that, so just thinking in terms of status, because I'm also thinking about the core value, which is about like selling out versus success. Now again, I wasn't thinking of this in terms of a cautionary tale, so I'm thinking, oh no, he didn't sell out because he has this overarching ethic that he follows. And you have this disciplined protagonist who is navigating the world according to their internal compass, which his is sort of his is dictated by sort of his existing framework. And I don't think that and so when, because I'm also thinking about like what other protagonists like we've identified as status admiration. So for example, Hercule Poirot in Murder on the Orient Express, this is like completely separate, but he is we flagged him as a status admiration because he's someone who like whose example you want to follow. And I think that so the question that I would ask is, so do you think that like John coming back to like coming back into business, do you think that we're meant to understand that that is the wrong choice, or that that is like a bad choice to make?
So you're saying, looking at it through the status lens, we're learning to live by a code. Like, that's the thing, is you don't break the rules, you live by the code. And I'm saying, I guess Yeah, that's so interesting because the way I was reading it is, um, can you, like, what John needs to do is break frame and forgive himself and realize that he can do this without a third party holding him up. And so I don't know, maybe I was reading myself too much into the movie. But where do you
Probably means they did a great job.
yeah, that's right. So where do you see, like, so you see what moments in the movie do you see as like testing that status?
I think that this is where, and also I just want to say as an aside, the way I'm thinking about status too is like about him accepting his role in the underworld because he's the best of the best. And so, like, I'm thinking right in terms of roles as well. But when I'm thinking about moments where that's tested, I'm thinking in terms of like him having to decide between selling out his code and surviving. Because if you sell out your codes, right, survival gets it has its pros and cons to be sure, but it's also his sticking to the codes that, like, throughout the story enables his survival as well, right? Marcus is on his side. He kind of starts looking out for him. He gets the tip off from the manager at the Continental that Vigo, right, is about to leave in the helicopter. And so the way that I'm seeing that being tested is there are all these people who are willing to do all these things to sort of ensure their own survival or to, kill the person that they're looking to kill. And John continues to come up against that and is sort of continually choosing to follow his own ethic in even as he sort of is pursuing survival, even when it's not always advantageous. That's kind of the way that I was looking at that.
I can get on board with that. I'm trying. I want to fight it, but I can get on board with that. Yeah, it's funny because I see that now as you step through, and that never even crossed my mind as I was looking at it. And so let's put a pin in that because we can come back to it after we go through the Five Commandments and revisit it. Because now I'm guessing that when we get to the Five Commandments, we may have different moments in the Five Commandments as well. So that'll be interesting. So let's put a we definitely agree on action, man against man, revenge. That is so on the page. It's very clear. So we've got that, and then we'll put a pin in secondary and come back to it. But you're swaying me. So uh so so let's look at structure genre. So I have arc plot because the story focuses on the change of a single active
Yep.
avatar.
Check. Yeah.
You agree? Okay. All right. What about the reality genre? What do you think it is?
The reality genre is kind of interesting because it's sort of like it's it's realism insofar as it's contemporary, like it's not in a, like, it's sort of set on Earth, but there is this sort of this fantastical element that's introduced right by this underworld and by the way that this world sort of works. So I would put like a stretch of realism.
Yeah, I put realism because, and this I really noticed this because again, was so 2 nights ago we ended up as a family discussing John Wick at the table, um, and so we were all talking about it, the four of us, and then Candace was like, "Well, now I want to watch John Wick 2," so that's why we watched it last night. And I noticed how in the first movie you don't actually see that world too much, right? You see the Continental, they've got some rules, but there's nothing that weird about it. But in the second one, it goes deep into that weird world because that's where you have the whole operator division where they're taking hits. You learn about marks. Yeah, so I think especially in this first one, it's heavily in the realism, although there are some, I don't even know. And this is, we're trying to, I think, figure out the best way to even talk about the reality genre because what they show is possible, right? There's nobody like flying. There's nobody with like science. There's no science fiction, right? It's actually throws back a little bit. But and again, that's more in the second one. But So I had realism too, and I think that's pretty good. Um, and for style genre, I just put cinematic. I felt like that was pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
All right, so what about the time genre? And we look at time genre through two lenses. So one is how the consumer of the creativity. So we would normally say reader if we're talking about a book, but the person watching the movie, and then the amount of time for the avatars in the story. So what do you have for the consumer side?
Yeah, on the consumer side, because we're in cinematic, because we're in movie, I would say that this is long because this is sort of like standard long form. It's like movie is like the novel equivalent in terms of like time genre and length. So I had that down as long form.
Yeah, me too. For the avatars, it was funny because when I watched it and the next day was like just making notes off memory, I put 2 days question mark. And then I actually went back and went through the movie and tracked like how many days, and it's 5 days that passes. So in the beginning, there's a little bit of like you're seeing like quick cuts of his relationship and all of that, but really it's like he wakes up on the day of the funeral, goes to the funeral, come home, the dog is delivered. He goes to bed. Next day, he does his driving at the airfield. That's where he meets Yosef, and then that night Yosef attacks. Day 3 is when he goes to see Aurelio. Vigo sends, and then that night Vigo sends his men to the house to try to kill John. Then day 4, he goes to the Continental. Then the Red Circle fight. And then that night is when Miss Perkins attacks him in his hotel room. Day 5, he goes to the church, burns that, kills Joseph. Marcus dies, and then that night he kills Vigo. So it's the characters experience 5 days throughout the movie. And that one I can say with confidence because I went back and checked. Let's talk about let's go into objects of desire next. This one I think we're going to agree and then disagree. So I'll go first since I made you go first on the content genre. So his conscious want is to get revenge for the murder of his dog and the theft of his car. So he's trying to kill Yosef. His need, and so this is where I'm tying this to the morality genre. So we're probably going to be different here, is to let go of his belief that he is cursed and be able to forgive himself.
Yeah, so we're definitely in agreement on the one, and that's the nice thing about the way that objects of desire tie into like sort of one to one to the genres. But then it also means that we're set up for problems because we have a disagreement uh, on the internal genre. But yeah, the want is that right. He wants revenge. He wants to avenge himself on Yosef for the murder of his dog and the theft of his car. And then the need I have, he needs to accept his role within the world.
And so talk some more about that. So you think he needs to accept his role as like he's an assassin, he's back, stop trying to fight this?
Yeah, the way that I'm thinking about it, because I'm trying to keep it locked into like what is happening in the confines of the story. Like what is the story saying? What are we meant to understand inside of this story? And I'm not sure that the way that I was seeing the movie was I wasn't seeing that John had a specific misunderstanding that he needed to rectify, which is why I wound up on that admiration side because he is like following this code that he has and he's because it's sort of the way that I was seeing it is like since being married to like since like leaving the business and being with his wife, John's life has been already like suffused with meaning. Like he has attained a sense of meaning and purpose and like a higher, almost like a higher code that he holds himself to now on principle. So when he loses his wife, I don't see that there's a misunder like he doesn't seem to be handling it wrongly, right? He doesn't go back into business because now he lost his wife, now he's mad and he's like, I'm going back into business because life stinks now. But instead, like it's not until Yosef kills his dog, right, which was his last kind of right, it was that last semblance of hope, that opportunity to grieve, that he goes to sort of avenge this wrong. and even in doing that, he follows this code that he has. And one of the things that I noticed is a lot of the avatars also talk about like meaning. So for example, in the beginning, Marcus is like, um this is going to be a rough quote, but it's something like, um there's no rhyme or reason. It's just days like this mixed in with all the rest, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
John actually doesn't subscribe to that. He's already found meaning, and he knows that he's lost his wife, but that doesn't mean, like, he doesn't sort of subscribe to that idea. And so he is driven by his own, again, that own internal sort of drive and compass and way of being in the world. And I didn't see that there was anything that he needed to change in that. It was just, he's been pulled back into the world, and he's good at what he does, and he's sort of following his ethic, and it's driving him. So I'm also thinking about the fact that I wasn't flagging anything that John needed to think about differently. And that's part of also what sort of like led me to something more like status admiration rather than something that requires a specific frame break, if that makes sense.
So you don't think so? The way I read the movie was, his plan was to kill Yosef and then just go home, and then I'm done with this life. I'm not going back. And that to me is the question on the table, which is, and that's what people keep asking him, are you back? And so to me, that's the question on the table that we're kind of waiting to see as the viewer, is like, is he back? Like, is he going to, and I think that's what changes at the turning point, which is this realization, I can't just go back home. I'm not going to be able to just kill Yosef and go home and everything's going to be back to normal. Do you agree with that assessment? Maybe I'm like categorizing it wrong, but that's the way I see it, is like, man, it's so interesting because part of me is like, why did he even go back? Like, why did he let this bring him back? And then that's starting to be like, well, they broke the code. They broke what they're allowed to do, and so he's going to make them suffer for that. But he also, again, would you agree, like, his plan through most of the movie is, I'm going to kill this kid and then I'm going to go home and keep living my life?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that where I'm like differing on that is I didn't get the sense that the movie was suggesting that his answer should be no, I'm not coming back. That was not necessarily the like what was like being telegraphed to me, that like, oh, John Wick should have said no, I'm not coming back.
Oh, okay. Now I see what you're saying. So tell me again what you had as the need.
I this is a little weak. Like, I probably could have made this language a little bit better. But just thinking in terms of like status admiration, I was thinking sort of like needs to like accept his role or accept his place within this world, and that comes out a little bit more clearly in the controlling idea that I came up with. But that's my sort of poorly or weakly worded need that I have.
Okay, well, let's jump down to the controlling idea then, and let's talk about that. So what did you have for the controlling idea?
I have life prevails when principled hitman John Wick accepts his role in a complex world and uses his skills and unrivaled discipline to avenge himself on underworld superpower Vigo Tarasov and his son Yosef.
Okay, that's really good. So here is my question. This is, and I'm literally curious. I really struggled with this because I realized, and this is part of like, as soon as I got into doing the analyzation, I'm like, oh, this is going to be harder than I thought, because this is not like a typical, of a vengeance plot is so much different than kind of like a typical action hero movie like Die Hard, right? There's a clear victim that he's trying to save in Die Hard, that John McClane's trying to save in Die Hard. I love that they're both named John. And where like I'm looking at the revenge plot, and I'm like, well, who's the victim? because the victim's already dead. And so, because we're going to go over that in the conventions, but I was like thinking about the victim, and then I was also thinking like, and so when you said life prevails, I think you're right, but you got to talk to me about. So we looked up, we found this infographic of all the kills, and we'll share that in the notes for the episode. But in this particular movie, John kills 77 people. That's the body count. And so in a movie where 77 people have died, um, and I had this thought. I'm like, um, they probably had people that loved them. Like, why does that not count? Like that, John's dog dies, so he has to kill 77 people. Like, I'm sure one of them had like a wife and kids somewhere that wanted them to come home. Anyway, I know that's not what the movie's about. Anyway,
Gonna bum us all out, Tim.
So talk to me about how life prevails in this movie.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll level with you honestly, right? I'm thinking about the languaging that we use generally for controlling ideas as they relate to our genre. So I'm kind of trying to use the formula and seeing if I utilize the formula that we sort of have, the formula, what is the word that I'm looking for? Like, we sort of have like a stock answer that we use, and you start filling in the details and seeing if it works. So life prevails. Okay, so there's a whole lot of death that happens, but not to John Wick, right? And that's like the protagonist. So you can say John Wick survives when, because it's life prevails. Like, not 100% there, but it's really about because the moment that John Wick is targeted by the antagonist, right? Like he is, in a way, like he's sort of positioned as the victim because he's the target of the antagonist. Now we have to talk about victim because John Wick is not agency deprived necessarily, but he overcomes the antagonist who is threatening his survival. So his survival prevails, right? He is able to survive this world as he pursues vengeance. And as something that I was thinking as you were talking about revenge plots are kind of they can be a bit weird or a bit tricky, because one of the things that you're sort of wrestling with is like, okay, am I meant to feel that this person shouldn't be getting revenge? Is their revenge driven by a misunderstanding? And I think that, and that was something else that was factoring in when I was thinking about this plot of vengeance. It doesn't seem like John is acting out of a misunderstanding or acting out of I didn't see evidence for a frame that needs to be broken, that as though his vengeance were like unjustified, or it was like John, like, right. He is dealing with problems in sort of the prescribed way for the world that kind of invaded his life, right? Because he was minding his business, and then this underworld comes and invades his space by coming in and killing his dog and taking his car. And so now he's been sort of sucked into it because of the way that it has come and invaded and taken from him and sort of imposed itself on him in a way.
Yeah, this morning I was going for another project I'm working on in StoryGrid. I was going over the archetypes, the heroic journey archetypes, and I was specifically looking at the Threshold Guardian, and I was like, well, so then I got to thinking, I'm like, well, who was the Threshold Guardian in John Wick? And I'm like, oh, it was the assassin team that Vigo sent, because that's so one of the things I didn't catch on my first watch, that it's one of those, the more I watch it, is the humor in this movie. Like, there are so many times I just laugh in the movie, because in one of them is when Vigo calls John to basically try to find out how mad John is, when his first contact with John, and John answers the phone and doesn't say anything. And then Vigo talks. And then John just hangs up the phone and never says anything. And then, what's the guy's name? I just think of him as the Vulture from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. His name's Avi, AVI. He says, what do he say? And Vigo just says, enough. Like he said enough, which he didn't say anything. So anyway, Vigo sends this assassin team, and I feel like that's the test, is like, is John Wick still the boogeyman, right? Because he just sends these guys that he knows John, the boogeyman, can just chew through without any effort, but he wants to see, like, how bad is this? And by John easily wiping out the assassin team, that's his crossing the threshold, and Vigo acting as the threshold guardian. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say that's true, and I think um, that's a significant moment that shifts us right into sort of a new. We're not talking about act structure yet, but I think that moment is really significant in shifting us into sort of like the rest of the story, right? It's showing us that like John Wick is entering this world, or again, like Vigo sends to his house, so this world is coming to John Wick, and it starts to feel like whether he likes it or not, it's coming to him.
Okay, so next let's look at the quadrant. So we break up a story into the beginning hook, middle breakdown, middle build up, and ending payoff. And so let's talk a little bit about where we think those show up, and what's interesting about those moments. So what do you have for the beginning hook?
I classify the beginning hook as the part of the movie that I sobbed all the way through. That's It's like until John starts killing people. I've seen this movie so many times, and I am just tears, just crying, and so anyway, that's how I
So I'm not
classify
the
my.
only one that cries in John. See, I don't cry at the beginning. I forgot there was one moment. It's at one of the moments, like in the middle of it. Something about, for me, when this is what gets me in movies, I've seen a pattern, is when heroes are forced into fighting when they just want to go home. And so there's this moment, I forget where it was in John Wick. I didn't cry this last time I watched it, but there was a time before that, and it was like a moment where it's like he just wants to go home. Just let him kill this kid. We all know he's going to get to him, you know. I cried there. There's a part in Django. I hadn't watched Django Unchained in years, and my oldest son was kind of working his way through the Tarantino library, and so I watched Django with him. There's the moment where they go to that plantation looking for those three brothers, and he starts like whipping the one brother, and it's showing flashbacks of him being at their mercy when they were beating up his wife. And I'm like sitting there with Connor, and I just start sobbing, and he like looks at me, he's like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine." And the other time that gets me is in Infinity War, in Avengers Infinity War, where they're in Wakanda at the end. It's the final battle, and there's that screen, and all the bad guys are like stopped at that screen, and then all the Avengers are running down towards it, and especially Captain America. I'm just like, he does not want to fight. Like, he doesn't want to be here, but he's here because that's the right thing to do. And so anytime a hero would rather not fight and would rather just be home, um, would rather be living in peace, but he stands up and fights when he has to, man, that destroys me. So anyway, yeah, I lost track. So we're talking about the beginning hook. You sobbed through the whole thing. Go ahead.
Yes, right. So the beginning hook, right? It starts with the beginning of the movie, and I have it ending right before Vigo's men arrive at John's house. So it's like it ends with John's refusal of Vigo's like, let us not be uncivilized, blah blah blah, and like him like kind of prepared, and less sort of labeled it as like his preparations for war. So sort of like everything right before Vigo's men, that scene where Vigo's men arrive at the house.
Yeah, I had the same thing. I put the scene before the I stopped it when they showed up at the house. So there's like this they show the outside of the house, and then they show a man running up, and that's at 28:06, and that's where I stopped it. Right before that is when he's like showering, and he's putting on his suit, and he's getting ready. That was right at 28:06, which I found a handy dandy time calculator on the internet, And that was 28, which I know that is 28:06, 28 minutes into the movie, and that's roughly 30% of the movie. So, um, yeah. So when we're looking at that, like what is significant about the crawl in all stories, right? What are we looking for when we're looking at the move from the beginning hook into the middle breakdown?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I'm looking for, especially with an action story. But in general, right, you're looking at that. We call it, moving into the extraordinary world. That's kind of how Sean also is like started labeling it, of like, this is where we start to move into the new world. So the protagonist has already, in one way or another, accepted that they're moving into this world, or they are going into this world, and then they experience it. And I'm also looking for an escalation of whatever has already happened, right? So like when you move into that middle build one, so what I'm thinking is it's an escalation. It starts with sort of an escalation of the stakes, right? So at the beginning, John's home is attacked, his dog is killed, he is beaten up, but he's not killed. And then at the beginning of middle build one, Vigo sends armed men to his home, so there's a lot more men, and the intent is not like, I'm going to take the car and kill the dog because I'm horrible. It is, we're coming to kill John Wick, right? So that's also, I'm looking for that kind of escalation in an action story to sort of to see those stakes rising with that first inciting incident that happens at the start of the second quadrant.
And one thing I was thinking about is there's always a moment, we talk about this in Heroic Journey, we talk about it in lots of different ways, but there's always a refusal of the call. Is there a refusal of the call in the beginning hook? Because I couldn't, because the whole thing, and this again is where it gets weird with the vengeance plot, because in most action stories there is a attack by the villain that will not stop unless the hero stops it, right? In a vengeance plot, all that has to happen to stop the dying and the killing and the threat is for the hero to stop, right? That's now, this is where as I thought through this, I'm like, well, you've got this kid, Yosef, who's just randomly attacking random people because he's a snot-nosed brat that wants what he wants. And by John putting an end to that, he will stop future suffering that this person will cause. But in the context and confines of the movie, all he has to do is stop, and the threat's gone. Like if when Vigo called him, he picked up the phone, was like, Vigo, we're cool, don't worry about it, I'll get a new dog, it's no big deal, the whole movie's over, right? And so it's not like Vigo's going to keep coming for him if John decides to stop. So I don't know. What do you think about that in that first quadrant? Because I was trying to think, like, is there a refusal of the call? Does that still apply when it's a vengeance plot? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I also kind of wrestled with this, and some of this was going to our obligatory moments in the action story. So, like, one of the ones that we have listed, right, is like hero sidesteps responsibility to take action, that kind of thing. And I also struggled with this, and my theory about this might be a stretch, but this was my thinking. So, and we also have like inciting attack or threat by the villain. And I see the inciting attack sort of as happening in two phases. And it starts with a threat. He goes to the gas station and Yosef is like, oh, that's a nice car. Like, how much do you want for it? And John, and this is where I see John as also, I've got a chip on my shoulder. As I'm sobbing through this whole first quadrant, all I could think was, John, if you just drove a Honda Civic, none of this would have ever happened. Like, just we could have avoided this whole drama. But no, you had to have the 1970 Mustang or whatever. So anyway, just me and my issues coming out here. But so what I'm thinking is that it starts with an inciting threat by the villain, and that's Yosef when he comes poking around. He's like, hey man, how much you want for the car? And John's like, it's not for sale. And he's like, everything has a price. And so when I'm thinking about the sidestepping of responsibility, I'm thinking about when John just ignores Yosef. He's like, right, not everything has a price, or not everything's. He says something in Russian and it's very dramatic. And so the way that I was sort of conceiving of this is that they sort of collapsed these moments down, this responsibility to take action. He doesn't rightly perceive the threat that Yosef is, and he's also trying to stay out of it. So rather than being like, "Hey kid, like don't be a jerk," like, or whatever, picking a fight or anything like that, he just tries to ignore him. He's just like, "Nope, not for sale," and he carries on his merry way. And I was kind of thinking that maybe what they did is they collapsed this moment down because we have audience expectations, but we also, like, the movie is set up, we know where this is going. And so I think it might not have been a great use of time to be like, having John Wick like, am I going to get involved? Am I not going to get involved? And so kind of shortening this moment. So we see him not opting for violence, like wanting to kind of like sidestep this conflict and not rightly assessing what that conflict is and moving on. And that's kind of how we see. So that I wouldn't call that like a full-blown refusal of the call, but I think that it might be an expression of sort of that sidestepping, taking action because he's trying to avoid the conflict. And that's when we get to the inciting attack where the conflict comes to him.
What do you think about the scene where he goes to see Aurelio, the guy running the car shop, right? Because before that scene, John does not know that it's Vigo's son that attacked John, right? So this is what I was starting to think might be the placeholder for the refusal of the call, because there's this level of like he goes to Aurelio because he's like, my car was stolen. It's a nice car. This is the guy in town who will know what happened to my car, right? And they're friends, so he goes to see him, and when he tells him it's Vigo's son, there's like this shift of this isn't just some kid, right? This isn't just some random person. Like, I think the stakes raise in John's mind. Like, I'm not just tracking down some kid. I'm tracking down, not only this huge crime boss's son, but this person I have a huge history with that is the reason I was able to get out of this life. Like, the stakes just shift completely. And again, I don't think it's on the page, and Danielle would get on to me for coming up with stuff that's not on the page. But I think there's this level of like there's a decision there of like, am I still going to pursue this even though the stakes just went up 100-fold? I don't know, but yeah, it's weird and it's hard. Again, with a revenge plot, all you have to do is stop. So if he's like, I'm not going to do this, everybody'd be like, cool. Where like most action stories, it's like, I'm not going to do this. And everybody's like, no, you have to do it. Or they get dragged into it or tricked into it, or, or the numinous pushes them into it anyway. All right. So that's quadrant one. We're looking now at the middle build one breakdown. I have for that, it starts or it ends when Miss Perkins comes into his room. So the red circle happens, and that's the fix it and forget it mission, which we'll get to. He goes back to his hotel. The doctor fixes him up, and then he lays down on the bed to rest. And that's at like 56:44, I think, is when they show Miss Perkins like coming into the room. What did you have?
I had something really close, and I was like constantly like fidgeting with like where exactly I saw that end happening. So I have it ending right before Miss Perkins attacks John. So I have it as it's when John fails to capture Yosef at the Red Circle, and then he like is injured and he returns to the Continental to get patched up. And I'm thinking in terms of, and we'll get to this when we talk about the Global Five Commandments, but the global turning point, right, happens at the end of Quadrant 2. And it represents the success or failure of the protagonist's essential tactic. And so my thinking here is that John fails to get what he wants. And it's sort of twofold, right? He falls into Vigo's trap because Vigo is like, oh, let's put him at the Red Circle. John's definitely going to come and we'll catch him there. And so John falls into the trap, and he also fails to get Yosef. So now he has to change his strategy. And what does he do in quadrant 3? Right, he starts going after, like, he tries to draw Vigo out to find out where his son is so he can go after him. And so I have it ending like right before, and then my inciting incident of quadrant 3 is Miss Perkins attacking John.
I think we're saying the same thing. So like I was going back, I have it up here, and I had it at 56:44, 56:44. And yeah, that's like, it's when he lays down on the bed to rest.
Oh, okay. And then
Right?
it's so immediately before she
Yeah.
comes
So
in.
that
Gotcha.
when she comes in, that's the beginning of the second middle build, the build up.
Gotcha. Yeah, sorry, I
Yeah.
misunderstood you.
Okay.
That's exactly what I had.
Yeah, and so because okay, so we have that, and I'm really interested to talk about this second middle build. So we call this the middle build up. Um so it starts when Miss Perkins comes in. When do you have it ending?
I have it ending when John kills Yosef, and like everything that sort of like happens, there's like a little bit of extra stuff that happens after he kills Yosef, right? He talks to Marcus, and as all that stuff, like the very end of all that stuff, it's right before Vigo kidnaps Marcus. Like it's sort of all the stuff up until Marcus gets kidnapped.
Yep, we have the same thing. So I have it ending when John has his final talk with Marcus, because that's a I felt like that was the resolution of the middle build up, is like that discussion he has with Marcus. Um, so what what do you think is so, and now see, this is where like, okay, Rachel's getting me, because I think, because what I was seeing in the second middle build, is when Miss Perkins tells him that Vigo sent her in the Continental. That's what, like, because up until that point, everybody was following all the rules. Like, John was not offended that Vigo sent guys to kill him, because that's what you do, right? And Vigo didn't take offense to the fact that John was killing all his men, because that's what you do. And and yeah, even setting him up at the red circle and all of that, like everybody's like following the path that they're supposed to follow. And it was when Vigo and Miss Perkins broke the rules, is when I feel like John was like, all right, I was mad before, but now I was mad at Yosef, but now I'm mad at Vigo because he broke the rules. Um, and so when he goes to the church, and like I felt like that's such a personal attack on Vigo. Um, but I didn't even see it as drawing him out. That's so funny. That's so true. But I didn't even catch that. It was more like I felt like he was just pissed, and so he went after Vigo. Uh, but yeah. Um, so talk a little bit about how you've read that third quadrant, the middle build too.
In terms of like anything specifically, or just how the events unfold,
Yeah, like how did you
generally.
read the events? Because I'm just
Mm.
realizing you're reading them completely different than me.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm thinking. So for starters, I thought that Miss Perkins attacking John as the inciting incident of quadrant 3, which we agree on sort of where it starts and ends. I thought that was such a specific escalation of the stakes, because even in his own home, John is less safe. At the Continental, there is an understanding that you don't do business on continental grounds, and so this is an escalation of risk to John, because now there's someone who's willing to break continental rules in an effort to kill him. And so so yeah, I mean, just the way that I was thinking about him going after Vigo's stash was that this was a tactic change, because the red circle was a trap, and it didn't, technically for Vigo it failed, and also for John it failed. But now he's sort of like, all right, if like Vigo is protecting his son, and he's also sort of like trying to entrap me and kill me, so I need to get to Vigo if I'm going to get to Yosef. And so I was seeing that as like a tactic change of moving his attention from like just getting Yosef to getting Vigo to sort of tell him himself, where's Yosef, right? And that's eventually what he's able to do after Vigo captures him, and then after he kills a lot more guys, and finally gets Vigo to tell him that he's in the safe house. So if you have more specific questions about that, I can talk about any of those different pieces, but that's kind of how I was seeing that all playing out.
Yeah, and why do you think Miss Perkins was willing to break the continental rules to go after John?
Hmm. I I honestly think that's just who Perkins is. I think she's an opportunist. Like I think, and again, if I'm thinking in terms of like double factor problem space and the way different characters navigate their context, right? I mean, even John says to Perkins, he's like, I didn't think you got out of bed for less than 2, right? And she's like, Vigo's offering me 4 if I break continental rules. And so she already has this established reputation that she only does like big jobs, and if there's enough pay, she'll do it, and it doesn't matter what you're asking her to do or what rules you're asking her to break. And this is how she has survived in this world, and then that's also the very thing that ends her survival in this world as well.
You don't think it, so I think it's specifically about John. So, and the reason is because there's that line when they're fighting where she says, "You always were a pussy." And so there's this level of like, John gets all this, it's kind of like, so in the CrossFit world, early on at the CrossFit Games, Rich Froning won over and over and over, this guy named Rich Froning. And then he left, he retired. And this guy, there was one year where a guy named Ben Smith won. And then the other guy, shit, I forgot his name. There's this other guy. Oh man. Anyway, there's this other guy, and he won like everyone after that. But the question is always, could he beat Rich Froning? Right? Because Froning went out on top, and in the CrossFit world, he's one of the most famous people. And so now, like, there's always this open question. And I feel like somebody like Perkins thinks she's better than everybody else, and she never got to prove it with John because he retired. And so I don't know. That one line got me wondering, like, would she have broken continental rules for anybody else but John? Right. But she wanted to prove she was better than John. Again, maybe I'm overreading it, but that was my take on it.
Could that be an issue of status and hierarchy?
Oh my God.
Oh my God, notes, ladies and gentlemen.
You coaxed me right into it. Oh man. Yeah, that's right. All right, so let's look at the ending payoff. So now this one's easy because we know when the middle build 2 ends. We know when the movie ends. So we have the ending payoff. So talk to me a little bit about the ending payoff and how you read that.
Yeah, so the ending payoff starts when Vigo kidnaps Marcus, right? And that's another escalation because now it's, Vigo is acting out against an ally of John's. And I think it's also, if you think about the ending payoff as an opportunity for the protagonist to enact whatever decision they made in the 3rd quadrant crisis, this is where John sort of gets the opportunity to do that, right? So because in the 3rd act, right, he's like, yeah, I'm thinking I'm back, right? So he comes to this decision that like, yeah, all right, I'm back. And then in quadrant 4, he gets to like act on that decision that he's made by going after Vigo because he kidnapped Marcus. And so then so that's sort of our inciting incident is Marcus being kidnapped. John goes and the thing is this, like, Vigo calls him, and John is like, there's no question that John is too late. He's never going to get to Marcus in time, but he comes back to the house. Marcus is already dead. And this is that decision to go after Vigo, right? After killing Marcus, this is really like, I'm back in the business. And I think I'm just kind of riffing, like thinking off the top of my head about this, but I kind of feel like Vigo is, what is the word that I'm looking for? Like a cause of disorder in the world of hitmen, right? He has all this power and he utilizes this power, and there's this sense that John Wick restores equilibrium by dealing with Vigo. Now, of course, there is a great deal of consequences to doing that, and John is mostly like, I don't think that he's thinking like, oh, this guy is a problem. You know, he killed Marcus. He's going and he's getting revenge now for Marcus, and they have their fight, which I'm really excited to talk about, the hero at the mercy of the villain scene, and John expressing his gift because it's so freaking cool. And then, of course, the Quadrant 4 ends with the end of the movie, right? When he has the fight, he wins the fight, goes and gets the dog, and then sort of walks off into the not sunset, into the night, into the darkness.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah, I thought it was interesting that there was no hesitation on John's part. Like when he got the call, he turned the car around and drove back. Why do you think Vigo called him?
Okay, without like offering like maybe taking my analytical hat, maybe just because Vigo's an asshole, but I think.
Well, but I'm putting myself in Vigo's shoes, right? This guy just mowed through, at this point, roughly 70 people, and including my son, who I basically sent him to kill. And I could kill Marcus and I could just walk away. And like, sure, maybe Wick would find out and decide that it was Vigo, but he could also just like cover it up and Wick would never come after him. And then there's the whole part where Wick is coming after him and he's like laughing the whole time in the car. And he's like joking around with Avi, his lawyer, his fixer, the Vulture. And so like, I don't know. I have an opinion, but I want your thoughts on like why he would call John Wick while standing over Marcus's body.
Oh yeah, okay. I can talk about this sensibly, I think, but I'm excited to hear hot takes on this decision. I think there are probably two things that I kind of read in that moment. Number one, Vigo is like bereft of his son. He doesn't really like his son, right? But what he says to John, he's like, you had your wife and I have my son. That's all that I have. You got the better deal. My son's a little jerk, but he's mine. He's what I have. And so he's been like, even though he led John Wick to his son and he gave him the location, I think he's still like, he's acting out of vengeance, right? Like he's killing Marcus. Marcus betrayed him, like not like kind of sort of, but he's acting out of vengeful anger and out of like, he's lost his son. And I also think that Vigo believes himself to have the upper hand here because he's about to run off in a helicopter, right? And he has Avi, right? He's like, oh, get everything ready for the helicopter. And so I think that Vigo kind of also believes himself to have the upper hand, but is open to the challenge of John coming after him, right? Because Vigo now has his own, like he has a bone to pick with John, like at a new level, because John's not just hunting his son now, but has hunted his son and has killed him. And so I think that there's this aspect of Vigo, I think that also wants to fight John Wick, and that is opening up the challenge if John can get there in time.
There's this like just horrific line in the second John Wick when Santino, I don't have the exact quote, but he basically tells John, well, who would I be if I didn't try to avenge my sister's murder, when he's the one that sent John to kill her,
right, right.
And see, I'm wondering in this, I think you're right, and I think there's a level of like, I think Vigo, at the moment he gives up his son, he crossed into the damned territory, right? So we talk about, there's death and then there's the fate worse than death. And at this point, Vigo has to live the rest of his life knowing he gave up his son to save himself. And that is such a breakdown of everything that is good and pure, right? Like that's what every parent knows. They would sacrifice themselves for their kid. Vigo doesn't do that. He does not sacrifice himself for his kid. And so I'm looking at this as like this almost at one point, and I said this to Candace and she's like, no, I don't think that's it. But I was like, I wonder if he's almost like committing suicide by John Wick. You know, like um and it's because even with the helicopter at the very, very end before the big fight scene between John and Vigo, Vigo's almost to the helicopter and John's far away. And he stops and turns around and waits for John to catch up so they can fight. And again, it's so interesting how like at the end of the third quadrant, um, Vigo will give up anything to live. And then at the end, he goes into something knowing he's probably going to die. Like, I don't think there's a point where he feels like, oh, I can best John Wick. I'm an old man. And like, I love and again, this is even where it's like this little subtle humor where like John like beats him up and he's sitting on the ground. He's just like, oh, oh, oh. And he's just kind of like, oh, that was he doesn't say it, but it's almost like, oh, that was a good shot, and he's like telling John to like give him a second so he could get back up. But yeah, I just felt like there was something in there of like, I have to face this guy because if I let him go home and I escape, I've got to live with this fact that I let the boogeyman loose on my son to save myself. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I do think that you're onto something, like in terms of like Vigo at this point has nothing left to lose because he also has lost all of his leverage on the city, right? It was like artwork and cash and like, okay, that had some value, but the leverage I had on this city, right? And so and then like you said, he does sell out his son so that he doesn't die. Like Vigo could have taken whatever that huge gun that John Wick is packing in that moment. He could have just taken that shot. It would have been over very quickly and saved his son, but he doesn't do that. He's like, all right, I'll tell you where he is. And so I think that by this point, because we see like Vigo has kind of started to crack a little bit right by the end. He's in the car and he's laughing hysterically, and Avi is like, oh my God, like what is happening?
Yeah. Like when he hands Avi the gun and then like pulls it back and then hands it to him and then pulls it back. I was right. Like, that part just cracks me up.
And so I think that there's this, I do think that you're seeing this thing happening in Vigo where like he doesn't have anything left, and so he's acting out of that place. He's acting out of, I've lost my son sort of by my own hands. John Wick is coming for me, and I if I'm gonna go down, I'm gonna go down in a blaze of glory, and I'm gonna take my shot at revenge on John Wick, even knowing that he's probably gonna lose.
And then do you think at the end, because of course he's got, if he lost, the inciting incident has to mirror the end, right? So he lost the dog, he gets a dog at the end. And I just thought, I felt like it was so significant that he picked a pit bull and not a cute little beagle. You know what I mean? Like the fact that and it was a pit bull slated to die. Like, so they were going to put that pit bull down. And so, yeah, I just felt like there was a significance of like, I'm going to find something to take care of, but it's a fighting dog, right? It's that marriage of both, right? I can still take some things from what I had, but I am this guy. I don't know.
That's really interesting because I didn't think about the fact that it was a pit bull. Like I wasn't like perceiving that as like, this is a fighting dog. I was like, oh look, he got a pit bull. That's very cute and very nice. Like I just was like, didn't even think about it. But I do think that this is like, and this is going back a little bit to like the way that I was thinking about the internal genre as well. It's like John knows that he needs to grieve. His grieving was interrupted, and he knows that he has to do it and he can't do it alone, right? So this was my chance to grieve unalone. And so he recognizes that I need to do this. This was cut short by this attack, but I need this. And so he goes and he gets the dog. And I'm thinking about it in terms of like, this is him like retaking that opportunity to grieve and that opportunity to do that with something to love, with something to look after, and following sort of the last mandate that his wife gave him, which is you need something to love. And so he's doing that when he gets this new dog. And so feeling like John knew that his wife was right and that he needed to grieve and he couldn't do it alone. And so he's taking that and he's integrating that at the end, and he's sort of at least internally picking back up where he was interrupted before, with that opportunity to love something and to go through that process.
Yeah, no, that's good. I hadn't picked up on that. All right, so one more thing about the structure I wanted to mention is how the actual opening scene of John Wick is the end, right? So the moment when he's killed Vigo, he's driving the Suburban or whatever it is and kind of crashes it and falls out. That they show that right at the beginning, and they show him kind of lay down as if like, and you're left wondering like, is he dead? So what do this is kind of a thing that people do, is they'll show you right a piece of the end at the beginning of a movie and then they go into it. What do you think that does for the viewer? Like, why, if I was able to like call the writer of the script and say like, hey, why'd you do that? Why'd you put that at the beginning? What do you think that gets a writer by doing something like that?
That's a good question. So Derek Kolstad is the guy who wrote this. Hopefully he doesn't call into StoryGrid and he's like, ma'am, you have filled the world with falsities. This is not.
I'm sure he's an avid listener to our podcast.
Right. He used the StoryGrid methodology to plot out the entire John Wick.
Yeah, I think he said that in an interview somewhere.
So I think, taking a piece from the end and using it at the beginning, I think, what it can do is it can do a couple of things. Number one, it helps set audience expectations for what kind of story you're in for. And I think this could be important for something like John Wick, because actually the beginning hook takes up a surprising amount of time. Like, before we get to like killing people and kicking asses, we have a lot of internal stuff that goes on. And so by seeding this little bit of like, there will be action, John Wick will get beat up, like we are getting there, but we're not there yet. I think that can be helpful to signal what kind of story we're in, especially because that entire beginning hook is not a lot of action, except for like, I mean, there's action in terms of like John Wick is getting beat up and his house is being attacked, but it's not like, if you're thinking even about like the movie trailer, probably not the stuff that you saw in the trailers.
Yeah, you're like, what is this? Right? This isn't like, what I came for.
This is the damn beginning of Up. I didn't sign up for this at all, right? So yeah. I think that it can help sort of seed that in.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, because like the opening of John Wick 2 is that like where he goes back to get his car, which is again just like so good. And Vigo's brother, right, is the guy who's running the thing, and like he is such comic relief in that whole first opening scene, because he's just like listening to the chaos that's happening outside of his door and just waiting for John to come in and kill him, anyway, no, that's good. I hadn't thought about like, hey, we're gonna have car chases, people are gonna get shot, people are gonna die, that's coming, and that little like 20 seconds seeds that whole thing.
I think it also makes a good like little bit of parallel, right? Because it opens with like John Wick, he kind of flops out of the car and he falls over, and then it moves into the video of him, like him watching the video of his wife, and that's where the movie, like when we get back to that scene that had opened up, he looks at his phone, right? He's looking at his wife and she says, "Let's go home, John." Right. And so what it does is it creates this nice little like parallel so that it bookends it really well, where we move, it sort of goes from like car into John watching that video of his wife. And then at the end, we watch him, car, he flops over, watches the video of his wife, right? And so it kind of creates those nice bookends for the story as well, to sort of like kind of close it all, right, and create like a kind of closed loop in that way.
All right, so next up, we need to look at the 5 commandments of storytelling. So before we get into that, Rachel, what are the 5 commandments and why are they useful?
Oh, okay. All right. This is a big topic because we use the 5 commandments at all levels of story, and they do so many things. So I will try to give like a nice, succinct version of the global 5 commandments. So the global 5 commandments really serve as our major way stations for the story. So what they do is they help us create an arc for our story, or help us identify an arc or a lack thereof in our work, right? If we're looking at it, we're trying to evaluate when it had, like, you know, where it's at, if it has a full arc, all that good stuff. So our inciting incident, right, is the event that kicks off the story. We uphold that the inciting incident has to come from outside of the protagonist because it's something that's forcing the protagonist to change. It's something that happens to the protagonist. So the protagonist is not inciting their own anything. Something comes from outside of them to incite the story. At the turning point, at the global level, we talk about that as something that represents the failure of the protagonist's initial strategy for dealing with the inciting incident. And so what that means is when you have a protagonist who has an inciting incident happen to them, they are going to come up with a way of dealing with that, right? They're going to have some kind of strategy for what they think is going to solve this problem. At the global turning point, which happens at the end of Act 2, that has failed. And they have to basically either they're going to have to change their tactic or they're going to double down and they're going to say, I'm going to keep doing the same thing and I'm just going to do it harder and hope that it works. And so then that leads us all the way up to our global crisis. And this is like the big question of the story. This happens sort of next to the all is lost moment in Act 3. And this is the major question that the protagonist has to answer. And it's sort of like, this is where we see whether they transformed or whether they doubled down, whether they were able to transform to their environment or whether they failed to transform. Now, generally, we say that generally because most stories are about protagonists who need to transform. In the case of something like Status Admiration, even like your worldview revelation stories that have highly integrated protagonists, there is a time like when your protagonist should be doubling down. So in that case, right, it's that they sort of refuse to compromise their morals or whatever it is. So it can look a little bit different depending on the kind of protagonist that you have. And then the climax is where the protagonist enacts whatever decision they made in the crisis. And that will be, sometimes this can look a couple of different ways. Generally, it'll sort of be the decision they make at the climax moment. And then what happens, because this is all happening in Act 3, is in Act 4, we see that in the fullest sort of expression, right? Where they pursue the villain or they, enact whatever plan they have to. So they'll make that climax decision. So this is, again, determining whether they sort of transformed or not. And then in Act 4, they have to actually prove it, right? They went through all this change and now they have to actually enact it in the world. And that's what happens in Quadrant 4. And then our resolution is the very end of the story. And it's, okay, our protagonist faced a crisis. They made a climax choice. What happened? How did it go for them? Like, how did it work out for them? And that's the sort of the basic function and the basic arc that we use with the 5 commandments at the global level.
All right. So what do you have as the inciting incident of John Wick?
I had for the inciting incident that Yosef Tarasov invades John Wick's home, stealing his car and killing his puppy.
Yep. I feel like that's pretty clear. And, one of the things that does, it's a very sad moment, but it makes me laugh that, like, on screen, there are 77 kills, but they move the camera so you don't see the dog die. So they don't show you the dog's death.
Yes, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty clear. There was a part of me for a long time that felt like, I was like, did the writer, Derek Kolstad?
I think, yeah, Derek Kolstad.
Did he basically, did he say to himself, like, what is the, not the dumbest thing, but like the smallest thing I could use to start off this movie, and it's like, we're gonna have a puppy die, right? So it's not like they came and killed his wife, you know, it's his puppy. So, but yeah, I think that's pretty clear. All right, so let's look at the turning point. So I have that it's when basically when Vigo breaks the rules to try to kill John. So this is when Miss Perkins comes into his room at the Continental. And this is the quick exchange where John says, I never knew Miss Perkins to get out of bed for less than three, talking about $3 million. And Miss Perkins responded, Vigo's giving me four to break hotel rules. So I feel like John takes it really personal and realizes like this, we're no longer playing by the set of rules that I thought we were playing by. And so to me that says, because the way I look for a turning point too is looking at like, when does the protagonist realize they're not going to be able to just go back to the way things were, right? Like we've now reached a point where I'm not going to do something and go backwards. I'm going to have to keep going forward. So that's what I had.
Yeah, I had something like similar in terms of like where it happened, but I identified it a little bit differently. So, the turning point that I identified was when John fails to capture Yosef at the club, because his original strategy for dealing with Yosef has failed. And then what happens after, right, is that he has to target Vigo in order to get to Yosef. So I think there's like a really similar. We're seeing kind of similar things and they're happening in similar places in the story, but we're just sort of identifying slightly differently. But I think you make a really good point about the fact that when Miss Perkins comes in, like it is like a decided change in the rules that they're playing by.
Yeah, because I was thinking the reason I didn't read it as the reason he went after Vigo was because he missed Yosef. Because to me, it's like the next thing to do is, well, where's Yosef now? Now I'm going to go find him there, because it took me, I had to like beat up Miss Perkins in the first place to find out. No. How did he find out? Oh, Winston told him that he was at the Red Circle. Left him the note. Yeah. So, to me, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to go find out where he is next. And I think Yosef would have stayed the target until Miss Perkins came into the room. So I didn't read him going after Vigo as like, well, now I have to do this to find Yosef. I felt it was like a response. And I think that's even in when Vigo's like freaking out about everything that got destroyed. And he's like, this stuff was priceless. And John would kind of laughed and was like, yeah, I kind of enjoyed that. And it's like up till then he wasn't going after Vigo, but it's like now it's like, well, you broke a rule to come after me, so now I'm coming after you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And also, right, that's where he gets the tip off, because Miss Perkins is the one who tells him, right, where to find that stuff. So she sort of enables him to enact a new strategy, because she kind of sells Vigo down the river too by telling John where his stash is.
Yeah. All right, so for Crisis, okay, so this is where I think we'll differ, because I left my notes the same, even though you swayed me, but on the internal genre. But I have, will John surrender to his dark side in order to get revenge, or will he let go of the dark side and lose his ability to get revenge? So I put this quote here, where Vigo says, a lot of us are rewarded for our misdeeds, which is why God took your wife and unleashed you upon me. This life follows you, it clings to you, infecting everyone who comes close to you. We are cursed, you and I. And John responds, on that we agree. So what did you have for the Crisis?
I did have the exact same moment. I think that the question that is being raised, and I phrased it way more generally than you did, but the big question is John Wick coming back, right? He is, and it's kind of interesting because this Crisis reminds me of a few different ones that we've actually seen. So in the Guild, in year 2, we've looked at The Old Man in the Sea, and we've also looked at The Prestige. And you sometimes have these crisis questions that kind of like linger, like they're present in the whole story, where like the protagonist at some point can sort of decide basically decide to quit, right? And the old man in the sea, he has a long period of time where he could be like, you know what, this fish isn't worth it. Like, I'm over it. I'm going home, or whatever else he could do. In the Prestige, Angier could maybe get that chip off of his shoulder and decide that he's going to go make a career for himself and not keep bothering and not keep, perpetuating this rivalry with Borden. And so John Wick, right, there's this constant question of, is he coming back? And what you'll see is that there's a point at which the protagonist is kind of backed into a corner and they are forced to really decide this once and for all. And so if you have that kind of lingering question, you need to sort of back them into a corner where they have to really make that decision. And that's what's happening here when John finally like has to opt in or opt out. And of course he says, right, yeah, I'm thinking I'm back. Sorry, spoiler alert, that's the climax.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is why like Danielle uses a lot of times that crisis matrix of like looking, the crisis isn't always just one point in time. It is something that's been building throughout the entire story. And so, but the crisis of, are you back or not? And so what was the climax?
So the basic climax is that he says, yeah, I'm thinking I'm back. And then, and so I see that as like just the climax moment, right? Where we see on the page or like in the movie that he has decided that he's coming back. And then we see him enacting that in Act 4 when he goes after Vigo.
That moves into the resolution. So he kills Yosef and then he goes after Vigo, and that's the 5 commandments. And so
and he gets a new dog. It's important.
And he gets a new dog. Yeah. Well, I think we'll cover that here in a little bit. Okay. So that's the 5 commandments. And again, like looking at those 5 commandments, that's how we, stories are always about change. And so that's how we track that change through the story. So now that we've done that, we want to look at the genre conventions and obligatory moments. So in this case, to remind everybody, our global genre is action, person against person, revenge. And so we pulled together the action conventions that are available at the StoryGrid website. And so let's talk through those. So what's the first convention?
So the first convention that I have in the list for an action story is you have to have a disturbed, unbalanced physical and social environment.
Yeah, do we have that?
I think we have that in spades in this story. We are in the world of Hitman. So already, right, there's a physical imbalance. It's these conventions are really setting up, making sure that the value at stake for your genre is like heavily contested, right? And this is really, really fulfilling that, because this is a world of people who kill for money, and that's definitely going to be a real threat to life. It's going to put those life and death stakes on the table. And then also, as a part of the unbalanced kind of, it's a combo, I think, of like unbalanced physical and social environment, is the fact that you have powerful mobsters like Vigo who control major resources and have the power to commit crimes without repercussions. And we see that in Yosef specifically.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about the disturbed, the intense setting and a disturbed, unbalanced setting, what actually comes to mind for me is the moment when Jimmy the cop comes to the door, and he opens the door, and at first when he's walking towards the door, he has it behind his gun behind John Wick has his gun behind his back. And what I just, it's all these little moments where you're like, am I reading into it, or did they do that on purpose? Because when he first opens the door, he only opens it like a crack, and then he waits a beat, and then he opens it all the way so that Johnny can like see in, or is it Jimmy or Johnny?
I think it's Jimmy.
Yeah, Jimmy the cop. So Jimmy like peeks around, and there's just like this body laying in the floor, and Jimmy just like completely takes it in stride because he knows about John Wick. And to me, that's where like you see this crazy world bump against the real world, and there's like, I don't know, the friction there of Jimmy just being like, all right, that's cool, I'm just gonna head out and let you do your thing, you know. And then I love like, because again, you know, I'm trying to separate what I know from movies 2 and 3 and just looking at movie 1. But to me, the first real glimpse we get at how this world is different is when he calls the cleaners and he drops those weird gold coins in the old man's hand, and they open up the van and they start cleaning up the house. And you're like, wait a second, like there's people that do this, you know, this isn't just like this killer, this like CIA assassin that, you know, is trying to live a normal life. Like there's like this whole, it starts like giving you a peek into this whole world. And then of course you see it at the Continental and everything. But I remember that moment where like they open up the van and just start cleaning up the house. I'm like, what is going on? Although I do think, like, I'm like watching the movie, I'm like, man, a gold coin gets you everything from one drink at the bar to like a night at a hotel and cleaning up a dead body. Like that coin, I don't understand the value of what one of those coins is.
These are not scaling properly.
Yeah,
I don't know.
All right. So next on my list is the dueling hierarchy. So a growth hierarchy is at odds with the power dominance hierarchy, or a dueling protagonist and antagonist. So what do you have for that?
Yeah, I think we have a little bit of both here. And again, you know, it's a bit weird to talk about the growth hierarchy like in a movie that's like about hitmen and that's like, well, they like kill people, and it's but the interesting thing, right, is that like the confines of the story is what determines like how we're looking at it. And so if the movie's not making specific moral judgments on it, then we are not necessarily meant to make specific moral judgments on it, right? So as in, this is just how this world works. This is what people do. And then, but it's how you do it that really determines what kind of actor you are in the environment. This is where we get into growth and power dominance hierarchy. So first, of course, we have a clear kind of dueling protagonist and antagonist. That's pretty clear between John and like Yosef kind of, but really Vigo is like the mastermind. Yosef is just kind of bumping around, trying not to die. But then in terms of the growth hierarchy, you have these things represented by things like bonds of loyalty, following the protocols and the rules like we see in the Continental. That's kind of our very specific representation of that. And John represents this, right? He avoids unnecessary death. You wouldn't think so, like it, just from like looking at it, right? But he keeps civilians out of it when they're fighting in the club. Like he is targeting only the guys who are from Tarasov. He doesn't kill Perkins when he could have. He actually lets her go. He lets Francis go as well, right? I love that moment when he's like, "Hello, Francis," and Francis is like, "Are you working, John?" Right?
Yeah,
and he's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
"Why don't you
Yeah,
take the
yeah.
night off, buddy?" Right. And so he has these loyal bonds that he follows, and his discipline and the way that he engages this specific world is representative of like a good actor in this world, right? How you ought to be if you occupy this world. And then you contrast that with Vigo, who is right, protecting his power and assets and using his power to maintain control over the city. He even sells out his own son in exchange for his own life. We talked about that last time. And then his son, right, uses all of his father's resources, and like he really abuses his position to get what he wants, take what he wants, take people's cars, kill their dogs like it's no big deal. He just thinks it's all fine. And he's just using, and it's not even like his own power. Like he's riding right on his father's power and resources. And then of course we also have Perkins, who is willing to break continental rules for a higher paycheck. And that is a behavior in this world that is not rewarded. And it helps us see that she is not a good actor.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. There was a moment when, like, again in Vigo and John's exchange, when he has John captured, where Vigo says, "You're still very much the John Wick of old," and John says, "Am I?" Vigo says, "People don't change, but times they do." And so there's this like glimpse of like Vigo thinks like, I'm trying to change, I'm trying to like make everybody more civilized, right? And he even references that later. and kind of looks at John as like, that's the old way that we did things, and we don't have to do that anymore as long as I'm in charge, right? I keep the peace. And so, yeah, I see it there too, of just like, it's because we talk a lot about that struggle between, tyranny and freedom, and right, like too much freedom and you have, too much chaos and it's bad, and too much order and it's bad, and you're looking for complexity. And you can see Vigo like tipping over into like, if everybody just lets me run things, everything's better and safer. And John is not playing by those rules. And so yeah, so like even Vigo in his own head is telling him a story that he, I think if you sat down with Vigo and had a conversation, he would see himself as the growth hierarchy. I'm trying to change things. I'm trying to become more civilized and not have these monsters out here running around killing everybody. So yeah, I love that. All right, so the next few conventions are pretty straightforward. We have the hero, the villain, and then we'll pause and talk about the victim again. So who's our hero?
Our hero is John Wick. Surprise.
Yes, and the villain is Vigo. And then this is the one where we started talking about this before, of what is a victim in a vengeance plot? Because in most action stories, we're looking at this kind of play between, the victim is being threatened by the villain and the hero is trying to stop the villain from threatening or hurting the victim. But in a vengeance plot, the victim's already been hurt. If we look at, the dog in this case. And so who are you seeing as the victim in this story?
Um, because John Wick is being overtly targeted by the antagonist, I sort of see him as the victim in this case. And it's interesting because in a revenge plot, the victim does look like differently. And so again, I'm sorry, I keep referring to the Prestige because we're doing it in the guild and I have watched it like 80,000 times.
Oh, every conversation I've had about story over the last 3 weeks, I've used John Wick as an example. So I'm like, it's just so deep into my head. Yeah.
So in the Prestige, it's interesting because we still have this similar revenge plot, but there's a couple things happening. So number one, Angier perceives himself as a victim, and that's really guiding a lot of his misunderstanding. But then you have victims who are collateral damage in the Prestige. So the thing about a revenge plot is that it can look a lot of different ways. I'm trying to like cast my memory back through the movie, and I'm not seeing, like, besides like the dog, right, who was harmed up front, who was sort of that initial victim. The only other victim I can think of is maybe like, Harry, he's a victim because he gets killed by Perkins in the Continental. But I mostly think that it's John because he is like the overt target of the antagonist. And that's something that we've discussed before in action stories, that at some point the hero becomes targeted by the antagonist. And in this case, he's kind of targeted from the very beginning, even before it, right, Yosef even knows who he is. He's been targeted by Yosef because he's like, I like that car, I'm going to get that car.
Yeah. The only other thing I kind of came up with was I think there is this level in a vengeance plot where you're almost like protecting society from this person, right? So if as the viewer of the movie, that if Yosef is left onto his own devices, he's going to kill somebody else. He's going to beat somebody else up. He's this source of chaotic damage too, where again, Vigo's very targeted. Vigo would not just randomly beat somebody up and take their car, right? So to me, there is this level of, in a vengeance plot, of like, and I also wonder, I mean, I don't think this is on the page, and so Danielle would not allow me to put this down as an actual analysis, but I think there's probably, in a lot of vengeance plots, there's a story in the protagonist's head about like, well, my reason to come after them is because they, killed somebody I love, but also somebody needs to stop this person because they're going to keep doing this. And so, but yeah, I do think, because a lot of time, that is one of the things, is like throughout an action movie or an action plot, the focus of the villain has to move from not just the victim, but particularly going after the hero. And maybe in a vengeance plot, that happens way earlier.
Yeah, and I just think, something that's like worth thinking about when we look at conventions in particular is like thinking about like what subgenre of action you're in, and then looking at that subgenre really specifically so you can explore the different ways that those conventions can play out and get like a deeper understanding at the subgenre level, so that you can still abide the conventions and see how they're playing out in your specific subgenre, because we're looking sort of broadly, right? We have these listed as broadly for the action story, but then they get even more specific as you go down to the subgenre level. So I think that's like always a really worthy exercise of, once you've identified your subgenre, looking more closely at examples in that subgenre and seeing how those play out.
Yeah, and I mean, this comes back to the reason why at StoryGrid we talk so much about looking at masterworks, right? So, and everybody always wants us to like lay out, the cheat sheet for every single genre, subgenre, and 12 examples of each one. And those are the times where it's like, we may get to that one day, but for now you can do it. Just like you're writing a vengeance plot action story, like watch 6 movies and fill out a full, analysis, just like we're doing here for John Wick. Read 6 vengeance story books, fill out a full analysis. And then once you do that, you're going to step back and look and be like, oh my God, look at this thing that keeps showing up over and over and over. All right, so let's look at the speech and praise of the villain. So at some point, an avatar or character must discover or point out how the villain appears unbeatable. The villain's point, the reason the antagonist will not give up, also must be revealed.
Yeah, so when I'm thinking about the speech and praise of the villain, there was probably a more overt moment that I'm like not thinking about in the movie, but a lot of times what you'll start to see, so that you don't get anything too monologue-y, is you'll see these sort of like broken up pieces of story that indicate to us, but basically the point of establishing the power of the villain and sort of what they're after. And so it tends to be like spread out over like multiple avenues and even over across like multiple scenes to sort of like create the picture of the villain. So in the way that I was thinking about this, I think when, like, as you're explaining it that way, I'm like, oh, actually, I think there are probably some way more specific moments than what I'm thinking of. But I feel like in this movie, a lot of the ways that they do this is by showing the power that the villain has. Because, and this is like, you can do this in written medium. It doesn't always work as well, but because we're in like visual medium of film, it means that you can like play with point of view. So we can see what Vigo's doing, right, when John isn't there. And we get these scenes where we're seeing his power demonstrated in the world. We're seeing what he's doing. We're seeing the resources at his disposal. And so this is where we are able to see like the extent of Vigo's power. And then, of course, Vigo also confirms these things himself to John, right? So like when he has John captured, he's like, you had your wife, I have my son. And I think it's clear to John as well, even from the beginning, that Vigo is going to come after him because he's trying to protect his son. So there's a lot of stuff that we sort of see, and then we play with that point of view to give us that information. What did you have like specific moments where Avatar sort of like let John know what he's up against? Because he's also familiar with Vigo. So I found that kind of an interesting dynamic at work as well in the story.
Yeah, I think what I'm looking for too is like my favorite part of whatever serves as the speech and praise of the villain is when you get to see the villain's point of view. Like, this is why they're doing things. And like, that's why a really great speech and praise of the villain, a really great speech and praise of the villain makes you think like, yeah, I kind of get it. Like I get why they're doing this. Like, it's wrong, But that's I could get on board with that argument at some point. And the one that again stands out to me, and I mentioned it earlier when we were talking about the turning point, was when Vigo says that they're cursed. And basically, we're cursed, and anybody that comes in contact with us are cursed. And John agrees with him. So I think there's this level of like, people like us do things this way, so it's like, you're trying to stop. I don't know, something about setting this up is like, look, the reason I'm here and I'm doing what I do is because this is what we do. And I'm playing my role in this world. And so, and again, like, I'm going through Heroic Journey 2.0, Sean's seminar right now. And, the antagonist is the one that does not have the growth mindset, right? So they're the ones that stays the same. And there's always some sort of nihilistic bent to them. And so that's where I feel like it comes out in Vigo, where it's like, I'm playing my role, you're playing your role. This is how the world works. And so to me, we get a little bit more of that. Like, it's not just that he's powerful, and it's not just that he has to protect his son, but it's almost like, why would I do anything different? This is my role. Because again, what makes the antagonist is their inability to grow and break frame.
Yeah, right. Which, yeah, that's a really good point, because Vigo has sort of like crystallized into the kind of person that he is. Like, we don't see, like, Vigo's not going to change. He is not only like in his frame, but he has also now established himself in a position in the city, right? And in a position of power that he doesn't have to change. And he's like, well, why would I, right? And so he sort of crystallizes into this character. And it's interesting then, because at the end we start to see him like breaking a little bit, right? Like, pieces of him are breaking, and rather than it being like a frame break, it's making him double down even harder and get like a little bit crazier as he breaks more and more.
Well, and that's where, like, when he gives up his son, I don't think anybody's surprised, right? Because they set that up early, when like he gives his son a drink and then like punches him in the stomach to make him puke it up, and then throws a rag on the ground to make him clean it up. So like, there's this level of like, my son is a tool that I use, and not there's no like loving intimacy there between him and his son. And yeah, and I when you said that of like fraying around the edges, because like, one of the parts I love is when Wick's coming after him at the end, and he's just laughing the whole time.
And poor Avi's like, what is going on? Like, would you please calm down?
Yeah, yeah. All right, so the deadline. There is a clock that establishes a limited time in which the protagonist must act to save the victim. So again, this is going to be different looking at a vengeance plot.
Yeah, and I think the way that this looks in, at least in this particular vengeance plot, again, I think it plays out in lots of different ways, but in this case, I think that there is an underlying deadline to this conflict, because somebody's going to have to kill somebody else first. And that means that John needs to move, and move quickly, because Vigo's coming after him. And so he has to come after Vigo, or he has to come after Yosef and then Vigo. And he needs to like beat him to the punch, right? It's like, you or me. And I have to act quickly so that it's me surviving and not you. So it's sort of a race of who can kill the other first. And that's where we get kind of that clock element. And then at the end, when he's trying to chase Vigo down before he gets to the helicopter as well, that's sort of like an ultra specific moment where there's like a very specific deadline that kind of gets established in the story.
Yep. I like that. All right. So the next one is set piece sequences. So fast-paced sequences show the reader the protagonist's strengths and weaknesses, as well as help the protagonist gain new skills. I mean, this is all pretty much there. The one part I wanted to ask your thought on is the part about the protagonist gaining new skills. Do you think that was a part of this?
I don't think so, which makes sense. Like, at least in the first one, I think we see, as far as I can think of, like, we only see like we see John's existing skill set. Um, and
Well, what do you think about, so there's that moment at the bar at the Continental where is it Addie?
Addie, yeah, the
What's her name?
bartender.
Where Addie says, "I've never seen you like this," and he's basically like, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Vulnerable." And so I wonder, like, and again, maybe I'm reading it too much into it, but I'd love again the end. We've talked about it where he doesn't pick the cute puppy, he picks the pit bull, and so it's like this. How I think the skill he gains throughout this movie is the ability to take the emotional side that his wife opened up in him and insert it into the strength he already has, and it adds a new level to his. I don't think there was an anger in John Wick 5 years ago when he came out, and I think there's this anger that drives him, that gives him even a new level to what he's able to do. So that's the only thing I could think of, because yeah, he pretty much does what everybody expects him to do throughout the entire movie.
Yeah, I really love that, just that addition of sort of the internal workings that are happening in John, because he is like, he has to learn how to grieve. Like he has to learn how to grieve in a really deep way. And so since I was thinking in terms of action story, I was really thinking in terms of like very external. But because you're right, like we don't really see him develop any new external skills. He's a highly established, highly skilled protagonist. But sort of integrating this, he's like learning to integrate this deeply personal element that he has never had before, and he's learning grief. He's learning like there are these new emotional layers that are being added to him as a character, and I actually think that's a really great observation. That was way better than my answer.
All right, so the last convention is the fast-paced and exciting plot. So the characters are put in extreme situations and forced to take risk. I think that's there.
Yeah, my document, I have like a single bullet underneath and just one word that says check, period. It's definitely there. We're good.
All right, so let's move on to the obligatory moments. So what when we talk about obligatory moments in genres, right? So this is, each genre has its own obligatory moments. What are genre obligatory moments?
Yeah, obligatory moments, they're similar to conventions in that they're helping us define audience expectations, and audience expectations for obligatory moments as it pertains to the development of the story and the things that help sort of guide the movements of the story. And you have so much freedom to create, but it adds some level of constraints, right? There's sort of that freedom within constraint. That's actually a really great thing about obligatory moments, because it helps you detail what audiences are expecting to see, because it's a part of the genre. And then you can think about how to meet those expectations in new and exciting ways. So those obligatory moments kind of, again, help us map out key moments that help us develop the actual progression of the story in terms of physical events and the things that we want to see sort of unfold on the page in the context of the story.
All right, so let's go through them here. So the first one is an inciting attack or threat by the villain. We have that. We've already talked about it with the inciting incident of Yosef attacking and taking his car and killing his dog. So what about, we'll move on to the second one, the hero sidesteps responsibility to take action.
Yeah, we talked about that one a little bit last time, because this is, in a revenge plot, you made this point that it was like, well, if they sidestep responsibility to take action, then they just won't go after revenge.
Right.
And so that was where, when I was watching this, when I was watching the movie and thinking about the obligatory moments, that's where I sort of came up with thinking that, because it says an inciting threat or inciting attack. And I feel like we kind of get both in the story, right? So we get the inciting threat when Yosef comes like with his friends and he's like, oh, that's a nice car. Like, how much? And John's like, it's not for sale. And he's like, well, everything has a price and blah. And John is, so that's the inciting threat, right? He shows, right, and especially when he sticks his head in the car and he's like, oh, I love dogs, right? And he sort of like grips the dog by the scruff of his neck, and he says everything has a price, right? So he has like his eye on this car, and now he's got his eye on John because he does not appreciate John sort of not giving him what he wants. And so I think about John sidestepping responsibility to take action, like at the level of the threat, right? Because he's like, he's not going to pick a fight. He's sort of just like, it's not for sale. Go away. Like, I'm not interested. And he does, like he like low key flexes when he says in Russian, right? Not this bitch, right? And he sort of is like, he is trying to tell him, like he's kind of trying to tell Yosef to like take a step back. And so that's kind of where I see, like, he doesn't address, like, so that serves as the initial threat, and he doesn't address the threat directly. He just is sort of trying to be like, all right, let's move on with our lives. Like, let's go away. And then that actually develops into the inciting attack. That's kind of the way that I looked at that, because otherwise, this stuff happens and like John takes time to bury his dog, but we don't get any implication that he's like not going to do something about this.
Yeah. And I like that because one of the things we talk about is the protagonist has to misread the threat, right? And so in that moment at the gas station, John misreads the threat, which is literally the only threat he misreads in the entire movie, right? Like everything else he understands, but it's like he does not, and because it's like the moments when he's pushing through the nightclub and he's surrounded by people and he never shoots the wrong person, right? But in that moment at the gas station, he misreads that Yosef is going to like completely wreck his life in the next 12 hours. And so, yeah. All right. So let's move on to forced to leave the ordinary world. The hero lashes out. And I put, well, the whole movie is him lashing out, but he goes after Yosef to kill him.
Yeah. We have this really great moment where when Vigo calls him, side note, I love when Vigo pulls out his like handwritten phone book. He's got his glasses on and he's like looking at it from a distance. Yeah. Just these little like golden comedic moments that they have like sprinkled in throughout the movie are like just perfection. But he sort of attempts, right, like a diplomatic resolution. He's like, hey, John, he's like, so I heard about your wife's, my condolences. That's a real bummer, man. Right. And he's like, let us not resort to violence. Right. And he's trying to give him the spiel. And like, John is dead quiet, hangs up the phone, and like that's that. And then like what happens next is like then he completely obliterates the men that Vigo sends. And so we kind of get this this little moment where we see that, John's coming for you, Vigo, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's that moment I mentioned before of like when Avi's like, what'd he say? And and Vigo responds, enough, which was nothing. Okay, the protagonist discovers and comes to understand the antagonist MacGuffin. So the villain's object of desire. So what did you have as the antagonist object of desire?
I have the that Vigo wants to kill John in order to protect his son. So like he wants to achieve a certain end for a specific reason is kind of the way that I was looking at that. And I thought that gets established pretty early. Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at the moment when he goes to the church as like he understands that what Vigo's trying to protect is his power, and so that's why he goes after that to draw out Vigo. And so I think we're both right. I think that both make sense.
It's kind of interesting the way that Vigo like talks about his son versus the way that he acts about his son. So like because in that same moment, right, when he was like, right, there was like there was cash and artwork not without its value, but the leverage I had on this city was priceless, right? And but he also says, like, he compares himself having his son to John having his wife. And he even says, right, you got the better deal, right? Basically, my son's a jerk and he sucks, but he's mine.
And he's still alive.
And he's still alive. And like, there's this, and so it's interesting because he talks about his son as something that he values, but then also like sells his son down the river. So there's this really interesting, like, because I'm thinking about like you identifying the MacGuffin as his power and maintaining his position and his power, and me identifying it as his son, but thinking about how there's this real, like, there's a difference between what he says and how he acts when he talks about the things that he values. And I think that's a really interesting quality of just Vigo as a villain. And when you're trying to identify that MacGuffin and thinking about, okay, what does he actually care about? And it's a little unclear whether it's really his son that he super cares about in this movie.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so let's look at the hero's initial strategy against the villain fails. So I think this is where Yosef, he tries to get Yosef at the red circle and doesn't get him, and so we have to move on. And again, I wanted to point out here, pointing out like when we talk about obligatory moments, this is a really good one to look at, where if you don't have this, the people, the viewers, the consumers will not trust the movie. You'll break them out of that understanding of what's happening in the movie, because if the hero wins every single time, then there's no stakes here, and it looks like if we don't see the hero fail, we don't get to see them rise above that. And one of the ways this is a little different, but it comes to mind, is the TV show Ted Lasso on Apple TV, which, like, I think the first season of Ted Lasso is some of the best television ever made, ever. Like, it's just so good. And I hated the second season. And one of the things I hated about it is they kept setting up problems and then immediately solving them. So, like, I think, like, the openings, I only saw it, I didn't even, anyway, the opening scene is when the raven hair beauty, I forgot his name, the football is life, that guy, he like kills a dog when he like kicks a soccer ball and it hits the dog. And literally it's like 2 episodes later, so I'm thinking like, okay, so this is going to be the season, is like the team is down and it's kind of showing up in this guy who's always up, and they've got to like figure out how to bring the team back together and win. And then like 2 episodes later, he like meets with the therapist one time and he's back to normal. And I'm like, whoa, what just happened? And then like, then Jamie, the like evil guy from the season before, they bring him back. I'm like, okay, so this is going to be the season where they got to figure out how to integrate him back. And literally like the next episode, he like, I forgot what he did. He does like one nice thing and then he's back, and I'm like, so this is where it's like, this is what happens if you do that, where like you have to show like the problem and then you have to see the hero fails, because that's the progressive complicating, which is like, we have to see that what I try the first time doesn't work, and then what I try the second time doesn't work. And that's how that's what pushes the hero to change at the end. But okay, so that was my monologue on that. All right, so
wait, can I insert something as well?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I think, and John Wick is such a great example, because even when you have a super skilled protagonist, they still have to fail. Like, they still have to get it wrong. And that's not indicative of their lack of skill. So like, if you have a protagonist who's gaining new skills or who needs to mature, like that, it's like, oh, well, it's easy to see how they would like fail and blah, 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 whatever they need to change. But even the highly skilled protagonist, like, has to, like, they have to go through they're like, I think we talk about them even in Story Grid as like try fail cycles, where you try things and they don't work, and then you have to adjust your strategy, because your otherwise your protagonist is just going to blow through there and like everything's going to work out, like, you don't have a story. And so even that highly skilled protagonist should have that initial strategy fail. And as they try more things, that also participates as the stakes are escalating with the story, that they're having to change their tactic to and adjust their strategy in order to meet these escalating stakes and to overcome escalating obstacles. Because that also, if everything your protagonist is doing is working, then the obstacles aren't escalating properly to continue challenging the protagonist and continue forcing those stakes higher and higher and higher as they're getting more and more difficult obstacles.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. All right, so the next one is the hero reaches the all is lost moment. What do you have for that?
I have that as the moment when Vigo captures John, and that's the all is lost moment. He's sort of backed into a corner here, and that's what I have.
Yeah, and I think that rolls right into the next one, which is the hero at the mercy of the villain, right? So this is the core event of the action story when the hero's gift is expressed. And so he's at the mercy of the villain when he's been captured. And I always at these moments think about Austin Powers when because it's a play on, it's what's the word? It's
A parody?
Yeah, of James Bond, right? Yeah. And he says something about, leaving the hero alone with one inept guard. It's like, cause it's like, why didn't Vigo just watch them kill him right there? He just walks out. He's like, they'll take care of him. Obviously,
It'll be fine.
John's not one to escape. But I do like how they set it up where the one guy that had beat John in the movie earlier, that Kirill, K-I-R-I-L-L, that bodyguard that stabs him with the broken bottle at the red circle, he's the one guard that stood against John and survived. And so having him there, that he has to fight that guy to escape. And I also love that Marcus, he only killed one of the guys. And John still was tied to a chair, had a bag over his head, and there's another guy standing there. And Marcus is like, I'm going to kill one, and John can handle this from here. He just gets up and walks off.
I actually had something different for the hero at the mercy of the villain.
Okay.
For that exact reason, because I thought, and actually, so my husband has a chip on his shoulder about this scene because he was like, ugh, John got help from the outside, because if it hadn't been for Marcus killing the guy, John would have been toast. There's no way he was going to get out of that. But that's actually one of the reasons why I didn't see this as the hero at the mercy of the villain. It was all is lost, but then the hero at the mercy of the villain is that climactic final showdown between the protagonist and the antagonist, because it's also where the hero expresses their gift. And so I thought that this couldn't qualify as that because Marcus sort of swoops in it. Now, it doesn't feel like Deus Ex Machina because we've been seeing Marcus, throughout helping John. But I thought that sort of in a way disqualified this moment from being hero at the mercy of the villain because of that external influence. This could all be in my head, but here we go. I'm going to give you my theory about hero at the mercy of the villain.
Yeah, I see the hero at the mercy of the villain is right before Vigo walks out, because at that point the hero, John, can't do anything. He's tied to the chair. There's guards standing there with guns. There's nothing he can do. So you see it as the final fight between Vigo and John?
Yeah, that's
but there's never a point where Vigo is more powerful than John.
And that's true. Except that, and again, this might be, maybe I'm stretching here, but Vigo does. So because I'm thinking about hero at the mercy of the villain again as because it's the core moment and it's the climactic scene. I generally see that as happening in Quadrant 4, because this is still a major battle that we're leading up to of the hero officially facing off against the villain. So now what they do have is John's out of bullets and Vigo pulls the knife. And so here's kind of the way that I see it playing out, because I'm also looking for John's unique gifts expressed. And I think that this happens in his pursuit of Vigo. So we get multiple aspects of John's gift happening as we lead up to this fight and then in the fight itself. So the first is that John's principles, which he's been displaying through this entire movie, pay off when he gets the tip off from the manager of the Continental about Vigo going, like where Vigo is at, where this ethic that he is expressed all through the movie is now paying off when he gets this tip off from the manager of the Continental. And then as he's pursuing Vigo, he uses his skills with the car, which were established at the beginning of the movie, to catch up with him and also eliminate a number of the peripheral antagonists and the number, like Vigo's men. And then finally, in the end, it is just John and just Vigo. And they're right, no bullets, just you and me. And then, of course, because Vigo's a villain and he's a jerk, he pulls a knife and he cheats. But what happens is that John uses his specific gift, right? Which John Wick is a man of focus, commitment, and sheer will. And what he does is he takes the knife and he actually plunges it into himself in order to get the upper hand on Vigo. And this is where we see that, I think, expressed, where his discipline and his commitment and that force of will comes to play, because he can't quite get, they're kind of grappling with each other and he can't quite get the upper hand on Vigo, but Vigo has this knife and he's trying to keep it from going into it. And there's this moment of realization of, if I take this hit, then I can get the upper hand on Vigo, right? So he plunges the knife into himself. He's willing to take that hit in order to, right? I think he breaks Vigo's arm and then he's able to take out the knife and stab Vigo. And that's how I kind of see that, what happens over this sequence is an expression of John's gift to overcome the antagonist. All the extra people are gone and it's just him and Vigo. And then it's his different skills that play out in him finally defeating the antagonist. So that's sort of the way that I was thinking about the hero at the mercy of the villain, because of, and I'm also I'm thinking also just sort of technically in terms of where it's supposed to fall and what kinds of things are supposed to happen and who's supposed to be using their gifts and all of that jazz. So that's my theory for the hero at the mercy of the villain.
Yeah, I like that. And I like what when you were talking about that, it's again, when we see Vigo give up his son, it's consistent with who he's been. And then when John is willing to basically kill himself because he is a man focused, he is going to get the final outcome and he will sacrifice every part of himself to get it. And so, yeah, I love that. All right, so let's look at the last obligatory moment. The hero's sacrifice is rewarded. So what do you see there?
Mine is just very short. Because I have a fixation on the dog. I was like, John gets a new dog. That's his reward. He gets a new dog and he gets to go home with his dog.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's both of those. Yeah, I love it. All right, so that got us through the conventions and obligatory moments for the genre. So now let's look at another tool we like to use here at StoryGrid, and that's the heroic journey archetypes. And so these archetypes are characters. Again, when we talk about archetypes, we're talking at that kind of mythical level, right? So these are not, these can show up in lots of different ways, but the archetypes do need to show up in the story somewhere. Again, it's kind of like conventions and obligatory moments. It's satisfying readers' expectations, but not just of the genre, of story in general. And so we have these here. We'll just start working through them. So we'll go through the easy ones first. All right, heroic agent. What do we got for that?
John Wick.
For the shadow agent, we have Vigo. All right, so now let's look at the mentor. So who plays the mentor when we're looking at John Wick?
Yeah, so I find this a really interesting exercise going through the archetypes, because it's they also can sort of shift and move throughout the story, right? So they're because there's sort of these archetypical roles, you can have characters sort of moving in and out of different roles and acting in different ways within the story. And I think it also is interesting because John is as a protagonist, he's kind of a mentor figure himself in terms of like for the audience, right? Like he is, again, he's sort of someone to emulate. Um, and so for the mentor figure, I wondered if his wife was sort of acting as this guiding force in his life a little, like it's this is like a part of him being more integrated as a person. And so I sort of this again, I found this sort of a difficult exercise for this movie. And so I kind of thought that she sort of has this kind of mentor impact on him because of how she like how his relationship with her has shaped him leading up to the movie, and how he sort of revisits that relationship at key moments throughout the story.
Yeah, I had Winston because I was thinking the mentor is, in a guide, an advisor, a teacher. And especially in that moment in the bar when he's trying to talk John out of it and telling him what's going to happen if he keeps going. And so, Winston plays this like fatherly figure towards John and the whole thing. And I think it's the way I read their relationship is like Winston misses him, but is glad he got out. And so the fact that he's like trying to he's telling him what's going to happen if he keeps going down this road. And he's right. And so I had Winston for that one.
Yeah, and I want to say too, I think Winston, like, he's kind of interesting because I think he does sort of have like play multiple roles in the story, and he plays specific roles in the world and then specific roles to John. So I think you're right. I think he does act as a mentor figure, and then I don't want to skip ahead too far, but also like he does have sort of this like heraldic role where he's also warning John of the consequences of his actions. And so it's sort of interesting the way that he kind of moves into different roles as a character, I think.
Yeah, I had him as the herald too. So if we look at the herald as the one that brings a message to the protagonist, or he often gives the call to adventure, but in this one, I think he's delivering the warning. Yeah, so I had him down. Yeah, actually when I think about archetypes. So actually, let's look at allies next. So, um, there's an allies and there's enemies, and these are going to be different. Obviously the allies are the ones helping the hero on their journey. The enemies are almost like the allies of the shadow agent, right? So they're like who did you have down for John's allies in this?
Yeah, John actually has a lot of allies in this story. So he has Marcus. I think Aurelio is definitely an ally, the guy who owns the car shop. Charon, the guy, he's played by Lance Riddick. He is the receptionist at the Continental, and then the hotel manager Winston is also an ally. And actually, I just thought of it, Harry as well becomes an ally for a brief moment.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I didn't have Harry down. Yeah, I agree with that. And this is where my favorite example of how people need, when you're thinking about archetypes, like be willing to get super creative. Because when I think of like, how can you get super creative with archetypes, I always go to the movie Castaway, the Tom Hanks movie. And the ally that helps Tom Hanks survive is is it a soccer ball or a volleyball?
It's a
It's
volleyball.
it's a volleyball, right? And like by the end, he's like drawn a face on it and giving it hair. And then like if you don't cry when he loses Wilson, like you are just a monster of a human being. And so like, but I really believe like Tom Hanks would not have survived that island without the two things. Actually, now it's Wilson, and then it's the box he doesn't open with the angel wings on it. Like those are the two things that he hangs on to that helps him survive. And so we've talked before on the podcast how like a mentor could be like an old book somebody found or a journal that they're reading throughout the story. And so yeah, so that's the allies. For enemies, I had Miss Perkins, Yosef. I had Victor and Gregory, which is Yosef's like partners in crime. Then I don't know how to say it, Kirill, the bodyguard that bested him, and then I just put minions as like all the people coming after John.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you have anybody else? Did I miss one?
I don't think so. That was the list that I had as well. Although I didn't even get nearly as specific with the names because I had to do way too much digging to figure out like what was that guy's name.
Yeah. So early on, when I was like trying to do my notes, I was just went to IMDb and like copy and pasted the character list just so I could like easily refer to it. All right. So let's look at the shapeshifters. So let's see. I've got a definition here. So the shapeshifter refers to a character that changes form or identity throughout the story. So this can be physical changes, but it can also be more abstract, like changings of morals or allegiances.
Yeah, I think that this something that I think is really cool about the concept of John Wick, like of the story, is that he kind of and we I don't think we see this as much in the first one as we sort of see in the second one, but he does sort of occupy a world of shapeshifters, right? These are all killers for hire, and so for a lot of them, if the contract is high enough, they don't mind switching allegiances because it's all just business, right? And so this really impacts the world that he occupies. But I think a really clear example of a shapeshifter would be Perkins. She is very much morally ambiguous. It's also interesting. I noticed this. I was like rewatching it last night, and she like physically can sort of shapeshift in a way because she can
Oh
dislocate
yeah.
her thumb. That scene makes me just want to cringe every time. And she can actually like physically, change her body, and she dislocates her thumb so that she can get out of the handcuffs. And it's also right, she sort of betrays Vigo as well when she tells John where to find his stuff, so that he doesn't in exchange for her life. So Miss Perkins does what's good for Miss Perkins, so she's always adapting to the environment to do that.
Yeah, I have her down as the shapeshifter and the trickster because there's this level of so with the trickster, they represent disruption, mischief, and humor. And so I look at her as like um, she it's like she enjoys playing around the edges of kind of doing whatever she thinks is best for herself. And but for shapeshifter, I also had Marcus because he, on one hand, he agrees to kill John. He agrees with Vigo, and then changes allegiances. And there's points in the movie where you're not sure what his allegiance is. You're like, did he miss when he shot John in his hotel room, or was he warning him? Um, and so, yeah. Did you have anything different for Trickster?
Yeah, so I also had Marcus down as a shapeshifter, because of
Okay.
the way that he changes allegiances. And then I kind of thought that maybe Marcus was also a trickster
Mm.
because of the way that he upsets the balance. Like he upsets the balance specifically for Vigo, because right, he's like, oh my gosh, if you had done your job, like I would, like John Wick would be dead. And also, so he's got a couple of things. He does sort of have this. I feel like he has a little bit of this chaotic worldview when he talks about, right, like there is no rhyme or reason to this life, just days like today mixed in with all the rest. And then he just kind of does stuff. Like that's his sort of operating worldview. And then he just kind of does stuff as like, there's so much of this that doesn't matter. And then when he, at the very end, when he decides, right, he says, I go out. I'm not going out on your terms, good sir. I go out on my terms, right? And he just really like again upsets the balance, even though he ultimately dies. Like he just upends everything that's happening by killing some of Vigo's men before he ultimately dies. And so he sort of again changes that status quo to go out on his own terms and going out with a fight. So that's why I kind of thought that he might also have this sort of trickster quality to him.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. So the last one is the Threshold Guardian, which we talked about last time. But what did you have for the Threshold Guardian?
I was thinking something that's interesting again about Winston. Winston is like everything and everybody. Like he is the everything man, which is probably why he's one of the best characters. But what's interesting is I think that Winston acts as a threshold guardian for the Continental and for sort of the world and the balance of the world that they occupy, because is sort of weighing the worthy and unworthy actors, right? And when Perkins breaks Continental rules, he revokes her membership, right? And so he is sort of weeding out some of the unworthy actors based on how they behave in the Continental. So even though he's not so much a threshold guardian, I think for John, um, he acts as a threshold guardian in this world, right? He's a well-established member. He knows everybody through the Continental. Like, he really occupies this very specific role within the world itself.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And then we talked about last time, the Threshold Guardian usually shows up in the crossover from the old world to the new world. And I looked at it as Vigo's first assassin team, because that's the testing to see if John is still the boogeyman. Um, so yeah, that's great. I always love looking through these archetypes. I always think it's interesting to see how they show up. All right, so let's end with we had decided beforehand, like, we would just talk through kind of some of our favorite moments in the movie and how we can take some of those away to help people as they're writing their own action story. So what's one of yours to get us started?
Yeah, one of my all-time favorite elements of this story is the world building. And it's the world building really specifically in service of the story that the writer and directors wanted to tell. So I'm gonna avoid the rant, but I'm gonna just touch on this. So this was a movie that was directed, written, created by guys who work in the stunt industry, right? And so they got to bring what they did when they created this movie was create a movie that enabled them to showcase their art form. And so what they did is they built a story that was going to enable them to do that, to really showcase, right, what again, what their specific art and what their specific skills are. And then they built a world that supports this kind of story. So it's not just that the world that they designed is just like cool as hell, right? Like, just so interesting, so detailed. And so for me as an audience member, it's so fun to be in that world with John Wick. But then it's also a world that is deeply intentional, that it constantly is keeping us inside of that action value space of life and death. It's providing obstacles as well as resources to John Wick. And it's, again, it is a world that supports this very specific kind of story so that it's both immersive and sort of relevant to the story that they're trying to tell, and actually makes better the story that they're trying to tell. And I think that is something that is just so masterfully done, and something that, whether you're a fantasy writer or you're telling your own kind of action story, crime story, whatever it is building out a context, building out a world that supports the creation of this specific story. That again, provides both obstacles and resources to your protagonist as they're navigating the central conflict of the story.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I sometimes forget about how the director was previously a stunt coordinator, and so bringing that into this, um, one of the things that, because John Wick, again, I think I said last time, was, when I went to see it, when I finally saw it, it wasn't in the theaters. It'd been out a while, and I was kind of like, all right, it's just another action movie. And then I saw it, I'm like, oh my God, I just loved it so much. And then, over the years, because I've been kind of reintroduced to it over the last like 6 or 9 months, because my sons are finally old enough I could start watching it with them. And so I hadn't watched it in a while. And so then watching it with them again, I'm like, oh my God, it's so good. And then as we're getting ready to record, I'm like, okay, so let's think about this. Like, why do I set John Wick apart from kind of the run of the mill action movies that I love, but like stacking them up against like James Bond would be one, right? And I love the newer James Bonds with Daniel Craig. I think they're great. But also, so okay, so those types of movies, what sets John Wick apart? And what I think is and Sean talks about this all the time, of like the if you deeply know your genre, that's what allows you to break to break cliches while staying within the conventions and obligatory moments, right? So I think they do. I think he does this really well in a couple ways with John. So one is John Wick looks clumsy. Like he's always like stumbling and like running into things. Like he does not come across as like a perfect assassin, right? Like there's all these times where he like seems to trip and fall. Like he does things like I was like at one point again watching the second and third one, I was like keeping track of how many times he kicks somebody in the groin. Like which was like it's almost like this thing you're not supposed to do because that's not like the right thing to do or the noble thing to do. And he will do any, like we've talked about, he'll do anything to win. And so I love that there's like this clumsy nature. Like he looks like he's clumsy, although he's doing all of these really precise things. So I love that. I also love that everybody kind of laughs at the fact that the movie was kicked off by the killing of a dog, and then that's through the whole thing. But that's a twist on the convention, because it's like it's usually like the wife or the best friend or like his family, or something happens at the beginning that like sets this thing in motion. And so the fact that like his wife dies of natural causes, or what we don't know, but some sort of illness, and then it's the dog that kicks the whole thing off. Again, I think that's what sets this apart. And then the world, like you talked about, is super interesting. But those two things for me stand out as like and then again, I would say I've talked about it before, is I love the preciseness of like the fighting movements are actual like jujitsu and judo and other forms of martial arts. The gunplay is very precise, and as far as like the way he uses the gun, the way he checks the bullets in the gun, how often he changes the magazines, like I think all of that being so precise is, again, not what most action movies do, but them being so specific on that like adds this whole new realm to it that it's never talked about, right? It's just there. And it's one of those that later, if you like happen to find out, you're like, oh yeah, that was awesome, but like your subconscious definitely picked up on it. So for me, that was a big thing for me. And again, it's that like, the deeper your genre, the better off you're going to be, because you're going to be able to twist things in a way that you won't know unless you understand the genre.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great point. This is like clearly the product of people who know and love their genre. They are deeply invested in it. They're deeply familiar with it. And it really comes across. And that's how they were able to create something. That's one of the ways. They did a lot of stuff, but that's one of the ways that they were able to create something so masterful. So I think it's a great advertisement for like, know your genre, get in there and get familiar with it. That's really what enables you to innovate.
Yeah, and I'll point out too, what I love about it too, and I think writers get stuck in this, is that it is unapologetic about what it is. And I think sometimes we as writers want to do something fancy or do something like super, I don't know, like out of the box or something, where it's like,
Or deep.
yeah, just like hitting it. And then this is what I've noticed in Sean. I've just learned this in the past few weeks working on my own story. And what Sean, so I'm right now telling a story that's a performance story with a love secondary, a marriage plot secondary. But then when I was mapping out the 20 core scenes, Sean was like, you have to do the status because that's green, but you also need to map out the action scenes, the 20 action scenes. I'm like, yeah, but it's not an action story. It's a performance. Like, why would I do this? And like, I'm thinking that, I've been hanging out with Sean long enough. I mostly just argue in my head than out loud anymore. And so I'm like, all right, let's do it. So Leslie and I have been working through my narrative path. And I did it. I mapped out the 20 scenes of both. We worked them to make sure they fit together. And then just yesterday, Sean was like, all right, tell me your story. And I was like, you don't want to go over like the specifics? He's like, no, just go through your 20 scenes for both. He's like, just tell me the story. Like you would, if we were hanging out somewhere, you tell me the story. So I took like 20, 25 minutes and I just told him the story. And what's crazy is all of the like internal stuff and all of the worldview stuff, all of the other stuff like automatically came out just by me trying to tell a really interesting story. Again, as we talk about on that green, like make it interesting to watch, right? And I think this is what people miss is they're like, well, I want to tell a worldview story, and so I'm going to really focus on the worldview, but they don't make it interesting. And you can't go backwards. Like you don't get the action by telling the worldview. You get the worldview by telling the action. And I think that shows up here is like they were unapologetic of like, I'm gonna, I'm gonna tell the best action story I possibly can. And all of a sudden, here we are hours into dissecting it, talking about, was it morality or was it status? And like all of these like things are swirled up in it. And it's been a real an eye-opening lesson for me to like, if I focus on the action, the other stuff can come in bonus. And I think that goes for love stories. I think that goes for anything.
Yeah, and it's like it's the externals where you also get to showcase the internal changes that you're interested in, right? It's like if someone's having a worldview change, like listening to them, think about it, maybe is not super interesting. But then when we see them like that, then those are the things like that like this is where your audience experiences like catharsis, or where they experience being moved emotionally, is because they are seeing a protagonist enacting these things like physically out in the world. This isn't just limited to the realm of their mind. Like it has actual stakes, and it basically like gives body or embodies the internal changes, because it has to come out in the world, and we're actually watching them change. We're watching them make different decisions, and we're watching them be tested and come up against obstacles and have to come up with solutions. And so those external events are the way that you show those key internal elements that are at work in your story.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So what else did you have? What were some of your favorite parts of the movie?
Yes, and I'm actually glad that we ended up talking about this when we talked about the failure of the initial strategy. But I love the way that they like their use of the highly skilled protagonist. This is I love a story where you just have a protagonist who's like super good at what they do, but there's also a lot of stuff that you have to really get right if you're going to have that kind of protagonist, right? So that's where we got into their strategies still have to fail. Like they still have to get it wrong. And it's not for lack of their abilities, but it's, some kind of misunderstanding or a key piece of information that they just don't know. But something has to, like they have to face obstacles. And a really key thing with the highly skilled protagonist, which we see in John Wick, is the obstacles have to match the skill level of the protagonist if he's going to be highly skilled. So that means if it's sort of like it has to scale up with the capabilities of the protagonist. So if you have a highly skilled protagonist, then you're going to need to come up with obstacles that are going to test and exceed the bounds of your protagonist's capabilities, because like otherwise they're just they're just rolling straight through the story. Like there's no stakes involved because we know they're going to win because they're so good at it, right? And so what it really demonstrates is the way that you escalate the capabilities and the obstacles presented by the antagonist to match the skills of the protagonist, and then how you continue to escalate that over the course of the story. Because if your protagonist starts highly skilled, then that means the obstacles have to start very difficult, and they're going to have to get more difficult throughout the story. And John Wick is a great example of how you pull that off, and how you start with a really large, like a really powerful antagonist, and then those stakes and those obstacles just keep escalating across the story.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I had not even thought about that, of like him being so skilled at the beginning and how the movie had to work because of that. That's really interesting. One of my favorites, I think I love the use of humor in it. I just think there's like these moments that it's kind of like the movie Snatch. Like I've watched that movie probably a dozen times now, and that's another one like I've just been kind of reintroduced to it in the past year, watching it with my boys, and first of all, it holds up. I've tried to show my kids some movies that they don't hold up. That one holds up, and like it's one of those that like every time I watch it, I'm like, oh, there's another joke I like missed the first dozen times I saw it. And I feel like that watching John Wick is there's like the moments where Vigo like has this old timey, like almost like a Rolodex notebook, you know, and he's like trying to see the number and he's dialing the phone. That makes me laugh. I love, and then of course when, you know, I think Avi's funny through the whole thing where he's like, keeps getting frustrated that he's like, I don't speak Russian, man, you know, and, there's all these like little points of humor in it that I think are like dropped in really well. And I will point this out, like the opening scene of John Wick 2, like when like it's Vigo's cousin, right? So the whole opening scene is John's going to get his car back because like he didn't get his car in the first one. And Vigo's cousin has the car and he's like sitting in his office and he hears just like chaos happening out there as John's coming for him. And it just keeps cutting back to him. And he's just sitting there like looking up and like looking around as he just hears chaos. And it is hilarious, you know? And there's like, I just love the way they drop these like little moments of humor into this, you know, obviously action-packed, violent vengeance plot. But sometimes those can just, what it made me think of is another vengeance plot, True Grit, and how like Matt Damon plays this character that's like so ridiculous, and you know, because he's the marshal. I think he's a U.S. Marshal, and he's like, it's just ridiculous. And there's this one line that my wife always say about our dog. It's like he says something to him, and Matt Damon's just like ever stalwart. You know, he just plays this like over the top. And I feel like in a vengeance plot, it like those little tiny moments of levity allow the audience to like take a breath, you know, because it's like without those little moments of humor, and I even think there's moments of humor in like John's clumsiness, right? Like there's this moment in the third one where like him and two other guys run out of bullets all at the same time. And so they're kind of like looking at each other. And then instead of like, it's like an old time Western where everybody draws their gun, but instead they're all trying to see who can reload the fastest, you know, but it's like this little moment of like, they're looking at each other like, well, what do we do now? You know, we're all out of bullets. And so, yeah, I just think those, you know, Sean talks about that. We talk about that when we're talking about like picking the point of view, is like how like up close and personal do you want the reader to be. Like in Hunger Games, you like will get out of breath because you're like in the action, because it's like you're reading it and it's happening in real time. And I think in John Wick being such an intense movie, like those little moments where you can let the audience laugh, it kind of like brings them down so that you can take them right back up. But it's those moments on a roller coaster where like you've been like going through twists and turns, and then it like comes up and you just kind of sit there as it goes around the corner, and then boom, there it goes again. So I love that about the movie. I think it does it really well.
Yeah, it's like have those moments to just sort of like release a little bit of the pressure so your head doesn't explode from like how exciting it is. And it's interesting that because something that you're also pointing out is they do a really good job of like using their genre to generate the humor, right? Using conventions and aspects of their genre to generate the humor so that it's like extra funny, and it's sort of almost like for the action story lover, it even feels maybe a little bit like an inside joke. And so I think that it's that's a great thing to think about too, is like aspects of the genre that can actually sort of produce those moments of humor to, especially if you're in this hot, like super fast paced plot where your audience needs like a moment to laugh every now and again. That's kind of I think that's a good thing to think about, right? How your genre can actually generate some of that humor.
Do you have anything else?
I did just have one more thing, which is, so I work a lot with fantasy writers. And so this is like an issue that's near and dear to my heart, which is the lack of over explanation that happens in the story. So in John Wick, we pretty much just kind of get chucked into the story. And so we don't get, like, everybody in the story is already in the know. The only thing that we kind of learn is who the heck John Wick is, and we're learning with Yosef. And they set that up really nicely so that it's not like, oh, like, who is John Wick? And we get, like, this sort of like goofy dialogue that's like, well, John Wick was blah, 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 right? And it's like everybody in the room knows, and there's no reason to tell anybody. But the way that they leverage, like, we learn about who John Wick is in the course of Vigo scolding his son for making an idiot mistake, because Yosef does not understand who John is, because Yosef's too young to know who John is, because he's not that old. And so if you think about, when John got out, he probably was a teenager, so he has no idea. And so that, like, using that relevant occasion to give us information, but then for the rest of the world, we're just in it. So we just watch John get on the phone. He pulls out some gold coins, and we're like, what? Gold coins? And then he's right, I'd like to make a dinner reservation. No explanation.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of dudes and like a kind of scary looking man in a hat shows up at his door with like a bunch of burly dudes in a truck, and they start cleaning up. And then they start wrapping up the bodies and pulling them out. And like, he shows up to the Continental, and they use all of these sort of like euphemisms, right? I'd like to make a dinner reservation. Have you come back to the fold, John? And they what it does is it establishes this world that we feel as the audience, it was turning, like this world was spinning and turning before we ever showed up. And it will continue to turn after we leave the movie. And that makes it feel really immersive, because it keeps us in the experience rather than reminding us that we're in a fictional setting by being like, well, the Continental works this way, right? And they just assume, like, you just have to catch up. You're going to watch, you're going to have to figure it out, because that's how it works. That's how life works, right? And so it keeps us locked into the story so that we're never pulled back into being like, ah, yes, I am an audience member watching John Wick and thinking about, like, how does this thing work, right? They're just raising questions and then answering them in the course of action, rather than, again, just explaining it to us and giving us like these clunky dialogue bits that are like, well, how we do things at the Continental. It always works like this, right? And you're just like, oh my God, please. And so that's something that John, especially as like the first story in a franchise, and just like chucking us into the deep end, makes it an absolute thrill to discover what this world is and how it works. And then, of course, in John Wick 2, it only gets better.
Thanks for watching this story grid analysis of the movie John Wick. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to download a PDF of our full analysis, you can do that right now at storygrid.com/Wick. If you like this analysis, we're going to keep doing these, and so make sure you get notified by subscribing to our YouTube channel and clicking that bell so you'll get notified of future videos. Thanks for watching, thanks for being a part of StoryGrid, and we'll see you in the next one.